Hello.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. Jeff, we're going to wait a few more minutes to see if a few more folk come on.
Yeah, just another minute. I think the dings have slowed down, so perhaps we're getting to the first group. But yeah, we got in a bit late this morning.
Hi, John Spears.
Hi, Siobhan. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Good.
You been well?
Well, I'll probably have a better idea of that in a few hours.
Yeah, you're with Jeff in that really early time zone over there.
Oh, is it 4 o'clock where you are, John?
Yep, 4 o'clock, yeah.
I do see that there is a name on here from BC, and Maureen, it would be 3 o'clock for her.
Wow, go Maureen. She gets the thumbs up today.
That is correct, you guys.
We are important in
Nope.
your life there, Maureen.
There's no video for me right now. Just saying.
Well, thanks for joining on, Maureen.
Indeed. And perhaps a good way to start out. Good morning, everyone. Certainly to those of you in the Americas and in Europe and in Western Asia, good afternoon and good evening in Australia and China. It's yes, where I come from. At the moment, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, as it is with John, Maureen at 3. But in looking at timing this conference, we looked at, what are reasonable waking hours around the world. I guess this is a bit of a stretch for reasonable, but it works. As we gather today, I do want to acknowledge this land from which we host you. Traditional lands here of the Cree, the Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and homeland of the Michif Nation. Regina Public Library is committed to working together with Indigenous peoples in a spirit of collaboration, reconciliation, and change. Welcome. Your staff team, Evolving to Welcome 2030, is in day 2. We are coming to you from the city of Regina, and you will see today my background is our Mosaic Stadium where we play football, and the Saskatchewan Roughriders are famous across Canada, right, John? Another John?
Yes.
That stadium has been unfortunately fairly empty for the last several months, but we are looking forward to getting back in there. We will just get underway today with our first speaker, and I've got a couple of quick, quick housekeeping kinds of announcements. I do want to ask that you keep your microphones off unless you're needing to ask a question or make a comment. I will introduce the speaker and their topic briefly. Of course, full details are on the website in the program section. Most sessions today, we have 3 of them, are presentation style with Q&A following the presentation. And for the Q&A, we ask that you, and it worked fairly well yesterday, simply unmute your mic and talk, or use the chat line. And either way, Siobhan or I will be able to catch those and make sure they come forward. So yes, Siobhan will facilitate the Q&A and I will assist. I ask that you speak clearly. We have within MetLib, we do use English, but recognizing that it is both not the first language of many of our members, but also technology can kind of make it a little more difficult as well. So please speak clearly in your presentations today and questions. And our first session today is from I mentioned yesterday we had Vickery from Toronto. Today we have another librarian from Canada who is in Canadian geography terms just down the road over here in Thunder Bay. John Payton is 43 years library assistant to chief librarian in his career, and currently chief librarian and CEO at Thunder Bay Public Library. Very much librarian involved in associations and organizations in the UK and Canada, and from in the Canadian context, certainly I know John, and from the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, of which he is also a member. We also have joining us today Joe Payton, who's a doctoral candidate in politics at the University of Nottingham. looking into Marxism, Leninism, democratic theory, and political economy of race. And today they're going to be talking to us about an analytical framework for achieving sustainable cultural change in public libraries, underpinned by the theories of Marx, Maslow, and management, and including practical examples of how the analytical framework can be applied. So without further ado, John and Joe.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'll go first, and then Joe will follow smoothly afterwards. I'm going to just share my screen with you now, and hope you can all see that. And welcome. As Jeff said, I work in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Superior, where it's 6 a.m., so quite late compared to some of you. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional land of the Ojibwe people, which was negotiated, shall we say, in the 1850 Robinson Superior Treaty. We're going to talk about the way we do things around here, which is organizational culture and a framework for managing cultural change in public libraries. Though I would add that this framework actually work in any library setting. It can also work in academic libraries, for example. And what we're going to talk about is based on both of our books. So we had a book published in 2019, which is the one that Jeff just referenced. I'm going to be talking mostly about that book. And then Joe's going to follow me in about 20 minutes time, talking about our latest book, which was only published this week, published on Monday by Routledge, called Public Libraries and Marxism. And the two books kind of go together and lay both a theoretical but also a very practical framework for understanding and changing public libraries. So the framework is premised on this spectrum of public libraries that suggests that there are three basic models of public library. And many times when I talk to library staff and ask them, what kind of library do you work in? They just give me the answer, well, I work in a public library. And there doesn't seem to be a kind of understanding beyond that, that there are in fact different models of public library, that not every public library is the same. And what I want to do this morning is explore with you these three models: the traditional library, the community-led library, and the needs-based library. And as the arrow on the screen suggests, there is a development from one to the other. And the idea is that by using this framework, you can identify which of these three models you currently operate. And then if you choose to change that model and move up the spectrum to another model, what kind of changes you need to make to achieve that. So it's a development evolving kind of model of public library evolution. The ideas that we drew on in forming this analytical framework were Marx, Maslow, and management, as Jeff referenced. So starting with Marx, we used his theory of base and superstructure to say that the base of the public library is basically its strategy, its purpose, its vision, its values, its direction. Also the structures of the public library, which are the staffing structure, the kind of job titles we have, the kind of job content that we ask our staff to do, and the systems that we operate, which is like the policies and the procedures. And we suggest that these form the base of the public library, and they then shape and determine the superstructure, which is the organizational culture, or in Marxist terms, the ideology of the public library. And again, not many people tend to think of the public library as having an ideology. They tend to view the public library as being somehow neutral and apolitical. And certainly, as Joe will demonstrate in his talk, they're very far from that. They are ideological, part of the ideological superstructure. In terms of Maslow, I'm sure you're all familiar with his hierarchy of needs, which starts at the bottom with these very basic needs about physiological survival, safety, a sense of belonging, and the mid-level needs of cognitive and self-esteem, those kind of things. And at the top of the pyramid, self-actualization and aesthetic needs. And although Maslow didn't strictly develop this as a pyramid, the pyramid was kind of applied to his thinking later. Certainly, he believed that in order to meet needs, community needs, library needs, we have to start at the bottom of this pyramid and work our way up. We can't start addressing mid-range or higher level needs until we've met those lower level needs, which is a challenge for many public libraries. And in terms of management, I'm borrowing here from Blue Ocean Strategy. I've got the titles and authors at the end of the talk on a slide. But Blue Ocean Strategy suggests that public libraries are not going to survive if they try and compete in the red ocean of competition that we find ourselves in these days. And that red ocean includes competitors like Google and Apple and Amazon, who've got vast resources that they could throw at doing things that we do, and they can do them better than we can because of the resources they've got available. So Blue Ocean Strategy suggests we need to get out of that red ocean of cutthroat competition, which we're never going to win as public sector organizations, and create our own blue ocean where the competition is irrelevant and where we are unique. And we do have many unique selling points as public libraries. The main one being, of course, that we don't charge any money for using our services. We are free at the point of need. And in order to create that blue ocean, we need to not only focus on our active patrons, the people who use us lots and often, but also focus on those soon to be non-patrons, i.e. those who use us at the moment, but will stop using us if we don't continue to meet their needs. We also need to reach out to refusing non-patrons, which are parts of the community that know we exist, know what we have to offer, but choose not to for various reasons. And then the very interesting territory on the outside of this circle, the unexplored non-patrons, who are those those people who don't even realize that they need us or don't even think that we exist for them. And given that, for example, at Thunder Bay, we only have membership of 30% of the community, you can see that there's 70% in these other circles that we could be engaging with. So that's the basis of the analytical framework. I'm going to now work through the kind of key characteristics of each of the three models, starting with the traditional library. And the traditional library is basically the library that was invented around the middle of the 19th century in Britain, that emerged from the Mechanics Institutes. And many libraries today around the world, certainly in the UK and Canada, which was my experience, still exhibit the characteristics of a traditional library. And this isn't a judgment call. All of these models are valid, but they are very distinct. And at the same time, your library may have some traits from all three, or from two or three of the models at the same time, because they're not completely distinct. And in fact, one model kind of emerges from the previous one, as I'll demonstrate. So what does the traditional library look like? Well, according to David Langt in his book Expect More, bad libraries build collections. So the traditional library is full of books, very focused on providing books and information, and not much else. And certainly this is popular with active patrons in the traditional library. The strategy is very much focused on people who currently use the library. The demographic tends to be older, female, educated. That's the kind of profile of the dominant reader in the traditional library. And the strategy is all about providing services to meet their needs and make their lives as good as possible. The systems that support this model tend to be disabling in the sense that they don't enable much change. They're pretty rigid, pretty fixed. There's lots of rules about the place, which gives us that adage, the way we do things around here. So you might talk to the staff in a traditional library and say, why do you do this thing in this particular way? And the answer would be, well, we've always done it that way. So there's not much kind of curiosity or exploration of other ways of doing things, because if the systems have stood the test of time, they've existed 150 years and there hasn't been a problem, if it's not broke, why fix it? The staff structure is also very fixed and very kind of rigid, with a hierarchy, which would have be like a traditional pyramid with the CEO at the top, and then coming down, directors and librarians and technicians and assistants. Be a chain of command. Everything would go up and down that chain, and services would be organized in silos or departments. So typically there'd be an adult lending department, a children's department, and a reference department. And certainly in many UK libraries, these are reflected in the architecture, whereby the reference library would be at the top of the building, the adult lending would be in the middle, and the children's library would be down in the basement, which kind of reflects the power structure also of the traditional public library. The service structure is very much about collections, as length suggests, lots of books, lots of information, and all housed in buildings. So the library is basically a building. Library services are delivered from library buildings, and a key feature of the service structure of a traditional library is desks. There will be desks everywhere with professional qualified staff sitting behind those desks, and the model is that you come to the desk to be served. And the organizational culture of the traditional library that's being driven by these strategies, systems, and structures is focused on the higher level needs of the patrons. The assumption is their lower and middle level needs have already been met, so we can now focus as a library on meeting those higher level needs. And I've got no way of proving this, but applying the Pareto principle and using my own experience in Canada and the UK, I would suggest that 80% of public libraries still follow most of these traits of the traditional library. So moving on to the community-led library, that's kind of in the middle. Now, as I said earlier, the community-led library doesn't just kind of appear overnight as a result of a revolution. It emerges from the traditional library through a process of evolution. And what happens is the best elements of the traditional library are carried forward into the community-led library, and the worst elements, the least useful elements, are left behind. So it is an evolutionary model. So how do we know if we have a community-led library? Well, here, according to David Lanks, again, in Expect More, is that good libraries build services. So the focus is no longer just on collections, it's also on services. And the strategy, if you think back to those circles I showed you earlier, are not only focused on active patrons and also making sure that the soon-to-be non-patrons don't disappear, but there's also a reaching out to those refusing non-patrons. And the refusing non-patrons could be, for example, people who are affluent enough to buy their own books and have their own access to the internet and don't really think that the public library, they don't need to use the public library. But the community-led library would be interested in their needs, in their aspirations, and would reach out to them and try and develop services that would meet those needs. The systems here are enabling rather than disabling. They enable the library staff working with the community to change things, to be more flexible in terms of service delivery. And the whole kind of operating system of the public library is a flexible framework. So there'll be guidelines rather than thick procedural manuals telling staff exactly how to do things. There'll be room for maneuver, for discretion, for innovation, for creativity, that kind of thing. And the staffing structure also would be much more fluid. It wouldn't be the fixed hierarchy and the silos and the departments. It'd be more of a matrix approach. Teams would be formed on a short, medium, or long-term basis to deal with particular issues or develop new services. Staff would be pulled from different parts of the organization, regardless of their status or their rank within the public library, and the focus would be on developing services to meet needs. The service structure, again, not so, I mean, the collection is always going to be there. Obviously, that's the core of the public library, the lifeblood of the public library. But here it will be supplemented by a whole range of services that would be community-led, based on the needs of the community. And staff wouldn't be static behind desks in the library. They'd be roving around. They'd be literally moving around the library, looking for opportunities to engage with patrons. And beyond that, they'd be going outside the library building, so not just about buildings, and reaching out into the community to deliver services wherever the community gathers. The organizational culture of the community-led library would be to focus on the middle level needs as well as the higher level needs. So here the culture is being driven by the strategy, the systems and the structures, and focuses, as I say, on those middle level needs. Then at the end of the spectrum, we have the needs-based library. And this isn't the end of the journey by any means, because the needs-based library is something that we constantly strive to achieve, but we never fully get there because we understand that our local communities and society is dynamic and always changing, and we're therefore constantly needing to evolve and change in response to that. So the needs-based library is not a destination, it's a journey. And the elements of the needs-based library are, according to Lanks, great libraries build communities. So again, in his book, Expect More, he said that the characteristic of a needs-based library is it's really around community building and community-based services. And the strategy here reaches out to every part of that circle that I showed you at the beginning. So it goes beyond the active patrons, the soon-to-be non-patrons, and the refusing non-patrons to get into this territory of the unexplored non-patrons. The people, for example, who've never used a public library, the people who as children weren't taken to the public library by their families. They've got no tradition of library use. They don't see a connection between them and their needs and the library. They see the library perhaps as some kind of remote academic, educational, bureaucratic organization that really isn't for them. So, and this is a sizable part of any local community. So definitely worth exploring and developing services in response to. The systems in the needs-based library are empowering. They're not just enabling, they give everybody in the organization, particularly the frontline staff, the ones who are coming into daily contact with the community, power to meet the needs of the people coming into the library. So the rules are very, very kind of loose here. And also the systems that are intuitive. So the staff don't need thick procedural manuals to understand how to operate these systems. And these systems are obvious to the community when they come in. They don't need to navigate bureaucracy. It's pretty clear how the library operates. The staff structure in the needs-based library is democratic in the true sense of the word, and could take the form, for example, of working circles, which are similar to the team-based approach I mentioned earlier. But here, the working circle, which would pull staff in based on their experience, their knowledge, their skills, but particularly their lived experience, to tackle an issue. In Thunder Bay, for example, we have these to look at racism in the city, to look at homelessness, to look at poverty. And the group is self-governing and decides who's going to be leading the working circle. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's the person with the highest status in the organization. It could be somebody with the most relevant lived experience. The service structure, as Lanks suggests, is all about communities and community building, which means forming partnerships with a whole host of organizations that themselves are based and linked into the community. And this notion of co-production is very important, whereby members of the community work alongside library staff. So we bring experience, skills, knowledge, lived experience of community and staff members together to co-produce, to plan, design, deliver, and evaluate public library services. And here, as you'd expect, the organizational culture is focused more on the lower level needs, so on those basic needs. If somebody hasn't got somewhere to live, if they're homeless, if they don't know where the next meal is coming from, the library service is not going to be able to engage them in higher level needs until it helps them to meet those very basic needs. So this means, as I say, working often in partnership with organizations that have the skills to meet those needs. So Thunder Bay Public Library, I would suggest when I arrived here 9 years ago, we were very much a traditional library. We've made some changes to our strategy, structures, systems and culture since then to now enable me to say that we're more of a community-led library. So our strategy, for example, is focused on systemic racism, on mitigating poverty and homelessness, which is significant in the city, in empowering youth, in also making the community more, making the library more diverse and inclusive, and taking an interest in the local environment. So this is the strategy that's driving the library service forward at the moment in our current plan 2019-2023. The structure of the library at the moment has working groups, so similar to those working circles I mentioned just now, whereby we pull staff together and use their lived experience in particular to address these issues of racism, poverty, homelessness, etc. And we also have a workers' council, which is a group of staff working directly with management to improve, taking more of an internal focus of the library to improve working conditions for staff at the library. Systems, we've abolished fines. We did this before the pandemic hit, and there was a kind of very practical reason for doing so. We got rid of fines because this was a barrier to people on low or no incomes, and we've seen a marked increase in use, particularly by those people on the outer edge of the circle I mentioned earlier, who are now coming into the library. Was the myth that you had to pay for the library or you'd be fined if you use the library has now been evaporated. We also made changes to our behavior policy to make it a more welcoming environment for library patrons. And in terms of our culture, it's being driven by partnerships. So we have the Anishinaabe Employment and Training Service working out of one of our libraries, which is an Indigenous training organization. We have an Indigenous council, which works with us to make sure we're meeting the needs of our significant Indigenous population. 15% of our population is Indigenous, which is the highest per capita rate of any city in Canada. We have an inclusion, diversity, equity and anti-racism panel as well, made up of staff and community members to address those issues. And we have a youth council. So these are all the markers of a community-led library in Thunder Bay. Just very quickly, in terms of where we drew our ideas from, Karl Marx, I'm sure you're very familiar with, and Abraham Maslow, and as I referenced earlier, also Blue Ocean Strategy was important to our thinking, and David Lanks expects more demand in better libraries for today's complex world. And certainly over the last year, we've seen that complexity grow with the challenges that the pandemic has given us. So I'm going to pause there and stop sharing my screen and allow Joe to continue the presentation, and then we'll both answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, great. I'll share my screen. I've requested to share my screen, but it says the host is disabled. All right, great. I'll try it again. Here we go.
That's good, Joe.
Great. Okay, thank you everyone. Ignore the name on my screen. I am Joe Payton. It's just a technical glitch, I'm afraid, but I'm the real article. Okay, so hello. Our book, Public Libraries and Marxism, basically provides a more concentrated outline of the theoretical framework introduced in our book, Managing Cultural Change in Public Libraries. So the book essentially outlines the theories and practices of public library services in the socialist countries, particularly the Soviet Union, North Korea, and Cuba. And it uses these experiences to propose a public library service for the working class. So the second chapter of the book offers a general Marxist interpretation of the public library, because although the case studies used in this book have approached public libraries in various ways, they share the same core interpretation of what they are. So my presentation basically outlines this shared interpretation. It identifies the fundamental assumptions and concepts informing the Marxist public library theories outlined in this book. So in the first section, I will define the concept of the public library. In the second part, I will explain the Marxist view that the library is a cultural category. I will then explore the relationship between the public library on the one hand and democracy, equality, and freedom on the other. And then in the final section, I will discuss the notion of the public librarian as a historical phenomenon. So first of all, what is the public library? Well, the foundation for the Marxist conception of the public library is contained in Vladimir Lenin's 1913 article, What Can Be Done for Public Education? Here, he gives the public library several characteristics. First, as a library, it is an information provider. It stores, organizes, maintains, and makes accessible informational material. Second, as a public service, its resources are not restricted to an exclusive minority. They extend to the masses, to the crowd, to the mob. A public library signifies, at least formally, that everyone, including the hoi polloi, has the right to use its services. For the Marxist, however, things are not as simple as this. For although by rights the public library is open to all, to give a right is one thing, to provide the possibility to enjoy that right is another. It is important, in other words, to distinguish between the public library in theory and the public library in reality. The latter must be situated within the economic structure of society and its social relations. Only then can one understand the essence of the public library as it exists in real life and not on paper. Only then can one obtain a scientific understanding of this phenomenon. So it's a fundamental Marxist thesis that the history of society is the history of class struggle. Every society has a ruling class and a subordinated class. And from ancient times onwards, the ruling class has established institutions and services to help maintain their rule. The state, the legal system, the army, the police, all of these coercive organs arose in order to control the oppressed classes in more or less explicit ways. For the Marxist, the public library was and is one of these institutions. It is an instrument of the ruling, property-owning class. It is a power organ whose main function is to perpetuate the prevailing system of social relations. In class societies, the public library is a class institution. It will never be neutral or apolitical. It will never serve everyone equally. The public library is a class institution, as I said, and it manifests the power of a definite class. A Marxist historical overview of the phenomenon can make this evident. So, the first public libraries emerged in the ancient civilizations of Greece, Egypt, and Rome. During this epoch, public libraries catered to a minority propertied male elite. And they basically disbarred the masses, who are illiterate and too downtrodden to use the libraries anyway. With the rise of feudalism, public libraries grew in size and number. Like their ancient counterparts, these libraries catered to the ruling minority, which consisted of feudal lords, priests, and the nobility. They excluded the exploited serfs and peasants, who remained illiterate and too oppressed to use them anyway. Little surprise then that the masses of ancient and feudal times did not view the public libraries as a means of enlightening themselves. Under capitalism, the public libraries serve a dual function. On the one hand, they serve as an instrument of class exclusion. They cater to the middle classes whilst excluding and discriminating against the workers. On the other hand, the traditional capitalist public library is an institution of class pacification. It aims to keep the workers docile and obedient, and with the aim of stabilizing capitalism. In this respect, it performs the same function as the ancient and feudal public libraries. The socialist revolution for the first time creates a public library that serves the working masses, the working class. The socialist state directs huge resources at building a public library service that aims to empower and enlighten the workers, chiefly in the interests of communist construction. At the same time, and in accordance with the objective and subjective conditions, the socialist public library censors bourgeois ideas and practices, since these may undermine the socialist system. Marxism maintains that it is only under communism, the class of society of the future, that truly public libraries can exist. Public libraries that can serve the entire population with no discrimination, no censorship. For Marxism, therefore, the public library does not automatically mean information and education for the majority of the population, that is, the working people. And that is why Marxism generally differentiates between three types, or more precisely, three phases in the development of the public library. The first type is a traditional library existing in the exploiting societies. This type caters primarily to the ruling and middle classes and to a small portion of the exploited. Here, the public character of the library is realized only exceptionally, never completely. The second type, or phase of development of the public library, is the community-led library. This is practiced during the transition from an exploiting society to communism. This is a public library for the poor, for 9/10 of the population. It suppresses the services and information resources that undermine socialism. This is almost a complete public library, with the only limitation being the suppression of capitalist influences. Finally, Marxism identifies the third type or phase of development of the public library, namely that of a communist society. Here there is a complete needs-based library, one that serves the entire population, and which has no limitations. It functions in accordance with Marx's distributive principle, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. So, Marxism views the public library as a cultural category. Culture, in its most general sense, denotes all the material and spiritual values created or being created by society in the course of history and characterizing the historical stage attained by society in its development. Culture always assumes a class character, both as to its ideological content and its practical aims. Every class uses culture in their struggle to advance their interests and create a society that empowers them. It is always the public library that mediates, fixes, and expresses in an institutional form the cultural relations between classes. It provides a good opportunity for the classes' cultural relationships to be expressed overtly, as it recognizes, at least formally, the right of any social group to use its services and information resources. The public library, as a cultural category, also reflects the various classes' cultural levels. On the one hand, it is a physical structure and therefore a form of material culture for a definite class. On the other hand, it is also an education provider and therefore a developer of the spiritual culture for a definite class. The public library thereby indicates which classes have developed their culture, or at least certain aspects of it, and it also indicates which classes have not. So in class societies, the public library is an expression of the factual inequality of the social classes and strata. First, it expresses that a given class is ruling, which subordinates all the other social groups to its interests. The public library also expresses that the ruling class has a dominant culture, which it utilizes in its own interest. It not only debars other classes from using the library to develop their own culture, it also uses the library for imposing cultural restrictions on the other classes and practicing its class dictatorship over them. The public library does not and cannot change social inequality by acknowledging on the cultural plane the formal equality of people. Since, according to Marxism, culture is a part of the superstructure, the public library, as a cultural institution, functions in order to stabilize the economic base, and by extension, the rule of the property-owning class. Nevertheless, it is also a key Marxist thesis that the superstructure has a relative autonomy from the economic base. And this means that culture has some room for maneuver. This means that the public library, as part of the superstructure, need not always serve the dominant economic forces, the dominant economic class. Just like the whole of cultural life, the public library possesses relative autonomy. This means that the public library may and does occasionally counterbalance the situational disadvantages of certain classes and social strata. It may and does modify such economic and other social circumstances that would otherwise remain unchanged. The public library may and does react back upon the economy, depending on given laws and within determined limits. This explains, for example, the fact that at the same economic development level, the various classes make efforts to realize different forms of public library, and the results of their activity lead to different utilization of the libraries. Under capitalism, for instance, the community-led and needs-based libraries have existed alongside the dominant traditional libraries. So, in bourgeois discourse, the public library is often equated with positive, widely supported ideals. The most common ones are democracy, freedom, and equality. This purported relationship has two aspects. On the one hand, the public library is presented as the embodiment of these principles. It supposedly realizes democracy, freedom, and equality in its organization and services. On the other hand, it is argued that public libraries support democracy, freedom, and equality within society at large. A Marxist analysis of the social content of these concepts shows that neither of these claims is true. In fact, the very presentation of this relationship is based upon unscientific assumptions. Bourgeois scholars begin by imagining a public library in general, one lacking in class content, and they then portray it as a promoter and embodiment of pure democracy, pure freedom, and pure equality, each of which is also given a neutral, above-class content. This presentation ignores the fact that each concept has a class essence, which in turn makes it misleading to talk about them as pure categories. Indeed, they cannot be compared as such. The pure public library cannot be compared to pure democracy, freedom, or equality, since none of these exist in reality. It is instead proper to compare the library of a particular class to the democracy, freedom, or equality of a particular class. So finally, I'm going to discuss briefly the notion of a public librarian as a historical phenomenon. So in capitalist countries, it is generally supposed that public libraries cannot function without public librarians, without trained professionals. The mainstream view is that without the latter, the former would dissolve into anarchy and disorganization. Running a public library requires a level of specialized knowledge and expertise that only educated professionals can provide. Well, Marxism rejects this view, and it does so upon the basis of historical facts. In ancient times, wealthy merchants, statesmen, and other elites funded public libraries out of their own pockets and staffed many of them with untrained slaves and servants. Since these people did not possess a formal training, and since they were not trained specialists, they were not public librarians in the modern sense of the word, in terms of professionals. With the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century, the state replaced the private individual as the chief creator of public libraries. It began building them on a far greater scale, which in turn led to greater demand for public librarians. This growth of public libraries, in terms of both number and size, resulted in the theories, methods, procedures, and forms of public library organization becoming more complex and sophisticated. Professionally trained public librarians became a necessity. Under socialism, as under capitalism, professional public library staffs remain necessary, since the average worker lacks the necessary knowledge to immediately organize the gigantic libraries effectively. Librarians are needed under socialism in order to manage the colossal book stocks and apply the most recent scientific methods of organization to meet the masses' complex and constantly evolving demands. This is not a permanent state of affairs, however. With the rapid development of technology, IT, and book and information stocks under socialism, the library functions become simplified over time. As this happens, the ordinary workers, who are better educated and more competent than ever, can perform more of the library administration tasks, and the trained professionals need to do less. In proportion as society progresses towards communism, the public library profession gradually withers away. The masses of workers will perform more of the library functions on a rotational, voluntary basis, and the historical distinction between the librarian and the patron will diminish. Under communism, there will be no longer any need for the specially trained library staff, separated from the people. The libraries will become truly public, not only in the sense that they serve everyone, but also in the sense that they are organized by everyone, the public. There will be no difference between librarians and patrons. Indeed, librarians as such will cease to exist. The profession will disappear. As such, the Marxist librarian fights to create a society not in which librarians are indispensable, but one in which there are no librarians. Or, to express the same point in a different way, they fight to create a society in which everyone can be a public librarian. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, John and Joe. Oh, there's Siobhan.
I think I'm recovering from Joe's last statement.
Oh.
And I think everybody else woke up during that one too. Whoa. So, this was a terrific presentation, gentlemen. Thank you very much. I first want to begin with John with first question. I'm going to jump in with the first question, and then of course, hopefully you'll have lots of other questions from other folks as well. John, how long did it take you to go from when you arrived in Thunder Bay to go from what you saw as a traditional library to the community-based library that you have now? And then if you were to project forward, and this is probably a little bit unfair, what would it take for you to get from community-based library to the needs-based library?
Okay, thanks. So yeah, quite a difficult question to answer because sometimes it's difficult to kind of calibrate these shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the shift in the strategy and the structures and the systems because that's the easy part. So, for example, shortly after I arrived here, we went through a whole strategic planning exercise. We held community conversations with the community, and we came up with a new strategic direction for the library. We could do that in 3 to 6 months. Here is the document, here is the strategy, here is the direction. I then took about 18 months to completely change the staffing structure of the library to reflect the new strategic directions because the old traditional staffing structure couldn't deliver these new strategic objectives around racism, poverty, and homelessness. So again, it's about an 18-month time period. It's a unionized environment, so things, take time as they should. So we're into like 2 years at that point. And then we started changing a lot of our systems. I say we abolished fines. We looked at every policy, every procedure, went through it and changed most of them again because they weren't fit for purpose any longer. They couldn't deliver the new strategy. We had to take a lot of barriers out of that, barriers to access, for example, out of the service. So I give that maybe another year to 18 months. So we're talking 5 years basically to get through those base elements of the change. And then of course there's the textbooks tell us there's always a time lag between those elements being put into place and the really important piece, which is the organizational culture shift. And I've been here nearly 9 years now, and I'm just seeing the green shoots coming through of that organizational cultural change. And it's interesting how it manifests itself. Sometimes it manifests itself in staff starting to use a new language. And of course, every culture is based on language. Language is very important to culture. So when I hear people using different ways to describe things within the library, I see that as an indication that cultural change is coming through. But what we're talking about fundamentally here is hearts and minds and attitudes and behaviors. And again, we're putting systems into place now where we can calibrate shifts in staff attitude, because that is what's going to ultimately drive the behavior. So long answer to your question is, I think you can change the base in 3 to 5 years. Changing the culture is going to be, a 9, 10, 15-year kind of process. And although we're on this journey now towards the needs-based library, we will, as I said, we will never arrive there fully, because that's not kind of how it works. But I would imagine in 5 years' time, perhaps, I could start talking about a Thunder Bay Public Library having emerging elements of a needs-based library.
Thank you. And Joe, I think that I've been trying to form my question, because there's so much going on in public libraries, at least here in the United States, trying to, and I guess it really is to think about the structures of the library more around the diversity, equity, and inclusion part of our work. And so I think, I guess what I'm looking for is there an example where you see, or have in your research and thinking about this book, where you've seen elements of the sort of change and shifting in librarianship into a much more pluralistic based profession, rather than sort of the structure that we see now?
Yeah, great question. I think an obvious contender as a successful example of this change happening is Thunder Bay, the public library. That's a clear example of when you have the right theories guiding the organization, you can promote this structural change from a traditional to a community-led, and ultimately even to a needs-based. I think the most important element in the whole process is ultimately having the right ideas, and we emphasize this in the book, that a traditional library won't stumble into a community-led, and a community-led won't stumble into a needs-based. It's not a natural, spontaneous process. If you just leave things as they are, nothing will change. It requires an active ideological commitment, which is why we argue that Marxism provides the best kind of way, and the quickest kind of way, the most deep and true insight into how to make these changes. But yeah, back to your question, I think obviously Thunder Bay Public Library is a great example of that. I think in England, not much has been going on. I mean, the Tory government's basically been, cutting public services. Libraries have been, year upon year, there've been less and less libraries being made. Most of them are traditional. They're kind of organized by quite conservative, traditionally minded people. So I think Canada and North America, USA, have got much better examples of where we are seeing more community-led and needs-based libraries emerging, definitely.
Okay, thank you. And then in the chat box, we have, I'm going to focus on the question from Carolyn Anthony. So how did you enlist the support of your board and/or governing authority to make significant cultural change in the orientation of the library? John, I think this is more focused with that.
Yeah, sure. So obviously taking your board with you is critical. And it goes back to that strategic development process that I mentioned earlier. So we used this community conversation as a model for developing our new strategic directions. We didn't go out and hire consultants who would charge us a lot of money to tell us kind of what we already knew. Rather, we did it ourselves. It was a homegrown process. We organized the community into focus groups of 8 to 15 people, made sure we covered every key demographic, particularly the Indigenous population, which is critical here. But one of those focus groups was our board. And what we did is we sat down with them and used the Hardwood Institute method of community conversations, which is a structured process of about an hour where you work through 10 questions. And what you want to get to at the end of the conversation is, what are the aspirations and what are the concerns of the community? Not what are they want from the library, but what are their aspirations and concerns? Because once we understand those as a library service, then we can develop services to respond to those. And so the board was one of these focus groups. But what we found when we went through that process was that the same issues kept emerging again and again and again. So racism was the #1 issue that came out of those conversations, because we've been named by Maclean's magazine as the race hates capital of Canada. I mean, we are on the front line here of the race and class struggle in Canada, I would contend, which is why the public library can play such a critical role. So we engaged the board in the strategic development process, and they identified racism, poverty, homelessness, youth as key aspirations and concerns, as did every other group that we spoke to through these community conversations. So the board was kind of invested in this cultural change process from the strategic direction point onwards. And they then understood when I went back to them and said, look, we need more resources to tackle these issues. We need to restructure the library completely. We need to transform the public library if we're really going to make an impact. And because they were in on that formulation from the beginning, they've been very supportive throughout.
So accessibility was a requirement there for sure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Joe, I'm going to sort of, Colin has, I don't know if you saw the comment from Colin in the chat box, and I want to have Colin come in, if you don't mind, Colin, talking about there are great libraries, transformational libraries in the UK, and he focuses on Manchester and the investment that's been made there. Are you aware of that, Joe?
No, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I really like Manchester. It's a really progressive city. Of course, Frederick Engels, one of my heroes, lived a long time in Manchester, and there's a great statue of him there. So and they've got a great history of the working class museum / library, and also People's Museum in Manchester. And I've been to the museums there, and they're really good. So I'm not surprised that great work's been done with the libraries there. So yeah, I think it's a good example of, there are some great examples out there of libraries changing, even in the UK. So thanks for pointing that out.
Colin, do you want to sort of explain sort of what is it that's happened in Manchester that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and just so folks are aware, I mean, I don't work in a library. I work for a systems company, but it's great to be part of MetLib as always. But
we know and love you, Colin.
Thank you, Siobhan. Yeah, I mean, Manchester, and there are some other examples as well. If you look at places like Norfolk and the Norwich libraries, where there has been investment in spite of the kind of downward trend, if you like, in public library spending and so on, in particularly in England. And I do always try and emphasize that the situation is different in Scotland, for example, in terms of how investment in libraries has taken place across the UK. But yeah, I mean, I think with Manchester, there has been significant investment. They've actually looked at, and looking at, John's presentation there around the movement of libraries through those different stages. From the outside, that's what I would see Manchester as having achieved, that they have gone through a transformation from a very traditional kind of service to one that is now, I think, from my perception, very much needs-based. They've gone through that community consultation process. They've worked very closely with different organizations, and in Manchester, not necessarily even just within kind of the cultural sector or within the council setting, but they've actually collaborated with people like Sainsbury's, some of the supermarket chains and things like that, to actually reposition where the service sits in the community. So I think there's at least one library there that's actually in a Sainsbury's supermarket, and just totally honing in on what the need and expectation is of the community, and then tapping into that community to transform the service and also attract the investment that's needed to drive some of that transformation. So, yeah, if you ever get a chance to talk to Neil McInnes, who's the Director of Cultural Services at Manchester, he's passionate librarian originally, but has diversified into the wider sector as well. But he's such an advocate and has achieved so much in Manchester, and it's great to see against that trend that we're seeing in the UK or in England of downward pressure on the library service.
So thanks, Colin. If I could just add that I don't think it's a coincidence that Manchester's going in this direction, because as Joe suggests, it's building on a history of working class labour movement currents, if you like. And I found the same when I came to Thunder Bay. I chose to come to Thunder Bay because it is a blue collar working class city with a very proud tradition of a very strong labour movement. I was astounded by how strong the unions are still here. That's all changed in the UK, as you know. Yep. At one time, this was the kind of communist hub of Canada because of all the Finnish bush workers coming over here. Winnipeg was also, there was a general strike in Winnipeg in 1919. There was all this activity going on, and we're not surprised that this was reflected in the public library. So back in the 20s and 30s, Thunder Bay had an incredibly progressive public library, doing outreach and programming that other public libraries weren't doing, because it was tapping into this current of the working class energy. And I see a similar process happening in Manchester. You only got to walk around Manchester and you can feel, but not just feel the history, but feel the energy that's driving it. And it's great to, as you say, have some leadership there, cultural leadership that is kind of really making the most of that. So thanks for pointing that out, Colin.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, and one more question I see from Claudia to both. There's two questions based on the behavior policy for John. Is the behavior policy in Thunder Bay for staff only, or for staff and visitors to the library? And then Joe, is there a change in behavior of library staff that's part of the systems in your book? Systems change in your book. Okay, so we'll go with John and then Joe. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, we've made changes as a result of this transformation piece, both in terms of our behaviour policy as it pertains to patrons. So I mean, Jeff will be probably aware of some of these issues, but for intoxication was a big issue within our behaviour policy. For example, we had a zero tolerance approach to patrons who were or appeared to be intoxicated, and we found that this was actually excluding large numbers of the community and from certain sections of the community. So we made changes to that behavior policy to say your behavior should be judged on how you behave, not on whether or not you're intoxicated. For example, you could be intoxicated and your behavior could be acceptable. If your behavior is unacceptable, then you would be probably asked to leave the library. So we made changes to the behavior policy for patrons, but also we made changes to the code of conduct, which, if you like, is the behavior policy of the staff, to include, for example, zero tolerance of racism within the staff base. So we had to mirror changes both internally for the staff behavior and externally for the patron behavior. Interestingly, we kind of loosened the public behavior piece and tightened up the staff behavior. It kind of went in that direction, bringing them more to the center process. Joe?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a change in the behavior of the library staff in the different systems you described? That's a great question. And the quick answer to that is yes. Even though I've been describing public libraries as kind of buildings and structures and systems, that's only really one part of the puzzle. Obviously, the people that work in the libraries are a crucial element of that. You can have the best buildings in the world, millions of books and great technology, but if you haven't got good librarians, good staff working in these libraries, then no amount of books or buildings will make a difference. So the behaviour of library staff is fundamental to the different forms of library. Our general argument is that, you know, the more traditional you get, the more you get the kind of librarian who kind of sits behind their desk, doesn't really interact with the patrons any more than they feel they really have to. Often they take snobbish kind of elitist attitudes to certain groups, particularly the working class, the poor, the racial minorities. They can be very snobbish and elitist. We found that can be a case in traditional libraries. And often they basically just try to keep themselves, you know, isolated from the patrons as much as they can, and just, you know, tend to their books and try to keep away from people a lot of the time, really, to be honest. And we argue that as you move towards a needs-based library under communism or even under capitalism, all those mentalities have to change, basically. The librarian has to become more concerned with the needs of the people in the community that need them the most, i.e., you know, the working class, the racial minorities, the marginalized, the oppressed. It's a duty of a librarian in these libraries to focus upon the needs of these people and really try to give them the best service possible, not to hide away from them, but to actively, you know, approach them and ask them, you know, are you happy? Have you got everything you want? These kinds of things. And we obviously hope that by creating, you know, structures and systems of certain structures and systems in the library, we can kind of, you know, encourage this kind of more different behavior amongst librarians. But again, it's not, you know, it's not an automatic process. We aren't assuming that, you know, if we create a certain system, then librarians are automatically going to change their behavior. We don't assume that at all. It requires an active ideological struggle, ideological education to create these new socialist librarians who have a you know, a proper class consciousness and who are concerned with ultimately, you know, improving the welfare of the working class.
Okay, let's see, are there any other questions out there for John and Joe? I'm not seeing anything. All right. John and Joe, thank you very, very much. It was a fabulous presentation. As tough as, you know, as shocking as it can be, saying, oh my God, you know, planned obsolescence of librarianship. All right, I think we're gonna now take John and Jeff, am I doing this correctly? We're gonna take about a 5-minute break, and then 11, what time is it then? 11:15 that we have our next panel?
Yeah, we'll take 5, and then we'll be roughly back on time. Sounds good.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right, folks, we'll be back in a few minutes, okay?
Good morning, afternoon, evening again, everyone. I'm just just waiting for a moment. We're next speaker is here, and just waiting to get him his co-host status so he can control the screen.
Brilliant. I think we're there. Jeff, would you like me to share and leap in, or?
There we go. Indeed, Matt has co-host, so I will briefly just quick introduction for Matt. What goes on between and beyond us, using strategic foresight to evolve in turbulent times. This presentation is going to be introducing a suite of tools for evaluating and developing staff capacity and relationships. Looking at how to map relationships, register their value and impact, both internally and externally, and how future uncertainties may cause this map and its relationships to change. Dr. Matt Finch is an adjunct research fellow at the University of Southern Queensland and also associate fellow at Oxford University's Said Business School. Take it away, Matt. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and I'm pleased to be following such an excellent session. Could somebody just let me know via the power of a nod that the screen share is working? Marvelous. Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're each on and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the form of words we use to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in Australia, and I'm here representing the University of Southern Queensland as an adjunct fellow, as I said. Also, today is Sorry Day, which is a day of commemoration of the injustices and inequities visited upon Australia's Indigenous populations, a chance to remember that truth-telling is an essential part of reconciliation. So the flags in front of you are the flags of Australia's Indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people. I'd also like to acknowledge the land of our host is Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. I think when we're lucky enough to be in these virtual spaces, coming together on Zoom across time zones and continents, it's really important to remember that each one of us sits on a piece of land with a particular history, including histories of who has been allowed to say that the land belongs to them or that they belong to the land, histories of power and privilege, histories of respect, inclusion, exclusion, and injustice. And acknowledging this and continuing the work of coming to terms with it is absolutely essential, even when we're living in these strange digitized clouds. So thank you for allowing me to acknowledge country in this way. And I apologize in advance if there are any mispronunciations of names in that acknowledgement. In this session, I'm going to introduce you to two ways of thinking, which I hope you'll find useful when it comes to exploring the future and the future of how we staff our library services. These are value-creating systems, a relational systems thinking approach to understanding value or the difference that we make within a system of relationships. And the other is strategic foresight, working with imagined futures to enrich decision-making in the present. So not prediction or preference, but those futures which lie in the corner of your vision, which can trouble or usefully enrich our decision-making in the here and now. So we're actually going to do a little bit of work together, which means it would be great for you to have a piece of paper or two on hand. You're not going to have to share anything that you draw, but I am going to get you to sketch a couple of things out so you actually feel what it's like to use these tools, which I think is the most useful use of our time together today. If you get interested in anything that happens over the next 50 minutes or so, This work is built on a substantial amount of research and practice, including these two books, Strategic Reframing by Rafael Ramirez and Angela Wilkinson, and Strategy for a Networked World by Ramirez and Ulf Manovic. Rafael Ramirez is the head of the Oxford Scenarios program, where I teach in my capacity as an associate fellow. You can see these books are pretty well worn and well thumbed, so they're not just dry academic texts, but they're really working guides to the question of the difference that we make in our environment and what the future might hold. I'll also produce a PDF with links to further reading if you get intrigued by anything that happens in the next 50 minutes. One of the things to remember is that when we talk about the future in this session, we are emphatically not talking about prediction, and nor are we talking about preference, not the futures that we can assign a probability to, not the futures that we might desire, but the contexts which we might have to inhabit in years to come, which stretch and challenge the frame through which we perceive what is going on in the here and now. And the image I've chosen here to illustrate this image is inspired by the strategic foresight analyst at the OECD, Joshua Polcher, who says, this kind of work is like a cautionary tale, like the tale of a tortoise and the hare. It doesn't have to come true in order for you to learn something from it. And in the same way, we'll be telling ourselves some tales of the future in order to stretch our perception of what might be going on and what might be about to happen. And this is really important because, you know, yesterday we had this session on data fluency and how important it is for the future of libraries. And this work complements this attention to data and evidence precisely because we cannot gather data and evidence from events which haven't happened yet. Any data-driven exploration from the future is really an expression of faith in a predictive model. And that model can only be tested with reference to events from the past. The future remains in some way unknown. And so even when we collect data and evidence, it's through a frame of expectation. We can see this even in the abstract for yesterday's session, which begins with this vision of 2030. 375 million jobs have been eliminated globally, forcing millions to switch occupations. This is the future communities everywhere may face if they do not immediately and intentionally help prepare their local workforce. This is a story of time to come, a decade away that hasn't arrived yet, moving into that world of stories which seek to shape and enrich our decision-making. I find it incredibly useful to refer to a comment from the Bodleian Library's Frankie Wilson at the Evidence-Based Library and Information Practitioners Conference in 2019. She says she supports evidence-informed decision-making precisely because sometimes organizations have to do things that the evidence tells them not to. And I hope that what we go through in this session will help to enrich our understanding of what that means. Of course, looking back over the past year or two, it's pretty clear what it feels like to go through a time of uncertainty. The global pandemic was not something that no public health professional could have predicted or warned us about, but it was something that tested our imaginations and our sense of what was plausible to expect or prepare for. So this is a news report from the BBC website talking about 5 ways to make hugging safer. And even as late as 2019, I could have not predicted or foreseen that this kind of story would be appearing on the BBC News website. Sometimes we find ourselves inhabiting a future that we simply hadn't prepared for, that had lain outside the bounds of our imagining. And my intention with this brief taste of tools today is to suggest how we can prepare for changing circumstances before we have to experience the brutal audit of going through an actual crisis. George Burt and Anup Karath-Nair, who've written on scenario planning in really intriguing and useful ways, describe these imagined futures as a space for unlearning. The word learn the etymology is from an old German word meaning a track or a furrow. And Burt and Nair argue that when we imagine the futures that would challenge us, this is a chance for us to unfurrow the land, to unlearn some of the assumptions we're making as leaders and strategists. We suspend them, keep them, but the imagined future becomes a kind of playground where we can look at other assumptions, other tracks, plant new seeds in the field of the imagination. And that means we're going to work together now and have at least a feeling of what this is like. So if you have a piece of paper to hand, now's the time to grab it. And I have copy paper, which I use with the long sides at the top and bottom in landscape orientation, but it's not obligatory. If you have something to make marks on and something to make marks with, I'd love you to join us in this process. The first thing we're going to do very briefly is we're not just speculating for its own sake. This is meant to inform decision-making in the present. And that means if we're going to tell a tale like the tortoise and the hare, we need a protagonist, someone who grounds our future visions in reality. Therefore, I'm going to ask you to take 1 minute and consider a decision, a significant strategic decision that you might be trying to explore, and which entity has to make that decision. Just take 60 seconds now and think of a decision that you might be trying to explore, maybe one where you can see there will be some uncertainty in how it plays out, and which entity has to make that decision. It might be an individual, it might be a team, it might be the board of a library, it might be a division, it might be a whole city. At any scale, from the individual to the national, a decision and an entity which has to make that decision. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds more to think through your choice. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is on that piece of paper, just to draw an island. I've obviously produced this beautiful artistic kidney bean shaped affair here, about half the size of the page, but right in the middle. I just want you to draw an island, and in the middle, put your decision maker at the heart of that island. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but you want to take up about 50% of the page right in the center and put your decision maker at the heart of the island. It doesn't matter if you draw them or you just write down who they are, just so they're there. And I'll give you a few seconds more to do that now. And then when you have that island, this story isn't just about the protagonist alone. We need to know who else is on the island with them. So therefore, you're going to add to that island every entity and actor that they interact with. This could be clients, superiors, funders, regulators, partners, but every single entity that they have a transaction with is going to join them on the island. So I'm actually going to give you 2 minutes to do this, but I want you to populate that island with the other entities that your decision maker interacts with. Sometimes when we do this at the business school, we talk about, who are all the people that your decision maker can shake hands with? It could include rivals and competitors in a business context. Maybe in the examples of a library, you can think of some organizations that you interact with that are in some way rivals or contenders for the same pot of money or for the same amount of users' leisure time in the public. But essentially, everyone who lives on that island with your decision maker, I'm going to give you about 1 minute more. You're not going to get everything done in 2 minutes, but it just gives you a taste of this process of mapping. And remember, depending on your decision maker, some of those actors might be internal to an organization or a city council or a body. Some of them might be external, but it's always based on the fact of there being an actual relationship between your decision maker and that other entity directly. Just a few more seconds left now. It's always quite nice to look back at the map after you think you've got everyone and just do a double check and say, who have I missed? Because it's often the case, you can spend an hour creating a map of these interactions and always you spot someone else. So in the last 10 seconds, just think, who else lives on that island with your decision maker? What other entities do they interact with? And it's the last 5 seconds now. Brilliant. Now we're going to talk a little bit now about value, because I want to think just a little bit about what difference those relationships make in each direction. starting to think a little bit about those relationships and the value that they generate. But don't worry, you're not going to have to draw right for a moment, because I actually just want to share a few thoughts or a quick word about value as we go on that journey. Some of you might recognize this lion. He's famous, but for tragic reasons. This is Cecil the lion, who was killed by a hunter, I believe a dentist from Milwaukee, who posed with the lion, having killed him. And this photograph was then circulated on social media, and the hunter was pilloried for the role that he took. This is an example from the Value Creating Systems book that reminds us to think about value, not just in terms of dollars, not just in terms of the quantitative, but in terms of those wider social values. The ensuing outcry turned the hunter into the prey of an online campaign which vilified his actions and values. Walter Palmer had paid $50,000 to kill the lion, but was that the value of the kill? Palmer got what he paid for, only to find that the cost might be much greater in terms of his notoriety, and that his personal values would be made public and questionable. It's also useful for us thinking that value is not just about people through the door or number of loans issued or metrics and measures, but a wider set of differences that we make within a community. I've put a slide here for those of you maybe to dig deeper when the PDF handout comes out, because there are many different approaches to understanding value. Trying to talk to the other party and find out what difference they think the relationship make is always one of the most valuable. But you might consider the Cambridge value questions that are on the left-hand side, which invite you to consider what value is captured, missed, destroyed, absent, or undiscovered in a network of relationships. Or you could do something as simple as drawing these two ice cream cones on the right-hand side, each one representing you or the other party, and revealing something of what is going on the surface between you, and then something of the values and drivers underpinning that. So there are various ways to enrich our understanding of the difference our relationships make. But for now, in the little time we have, I just want you to look at that map, and however you choose to annotate it, I just want you to look at each relationship and make a note somewhere. What difference does this relationship make in each direction? What difference does it make to both parties? I'm just going to give you a minute or two to do that. I don't mind how you annotate it, but just get on there somewhere. The value created, the difference made by each of those relationships in both directions. You've got about 1 minute left. Do keep on going. And hopefully already there are just some little revelations, even just mapping in this way. I'm realistic of how much one can be enlightened in 120 seconds. But when you look at the difference being made in both directions on that map, what does it reveal to you about the values being created by those relationships? Last few seconds now. Just look over that map one more time. Is there just one bit of information you could add? Is there something else you notice about those relationships? However you've decided to draw this map, what difference is being made? And wherever you've got to, that's time. It's in the nature of these sessions. I can just give you a feel for this work. We can't do it all in such a short time frame, but you get a taste of what it's like to map in this way. And maps are drawn by different people to reveal different things. Different cartographers have different techniques, different priorities, and different skills. Here's a map drawn in those happy times before the COVID era, when we might be doing these things in person on pieces of paper and Post-its and whiteboards. This one has a degree of artistic flair as it presents the relationships between different units of an organization. But even if you don't have that artistic inclination, the map will reveal something. So this very simple diagram here, showing the library embedded within the city council which hosts it, already starts to tell us something about independence, organization, and the relationships between different players of the game, even just at the very earliest stages of drawing such a map. Of course, we can achieve greater levels of complexity, and in some ways, the age of doing this online creates new opportunities for us to do this in depth, to record and share those maps and build them collaboratively in new ways. I'll be returning to this pretty high level of detail in the case study, which follows the hands-on portion of this session. But you can see this pretty little island here might yield some interesting information about the world of a public library. And if you start getting really sophisticated, you don't even just put the decision maker at the middle, and you start to think about the value generated in the relationships between the other actors on the island. You stop seeing yourself as the center of the universe and start saying, well, what difference do those other relationships make between those players in the game? So gradually you build more sophisticated models, but in fact, it's best for cartographers to find their own way to map this island, because you will know what is relevant to you, and you'll discover your blind spots as you go. So whatever you achieved in 2 minutes, you have an island that in some way captures these interactors and the difference made by those relationships. In order to think about the future and come to the tortoise and the hare strategic foresight part of this session, we need to think about the motivations of the other actors on the island. What forces, trends, or uncertainties drive their decisions? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to stop thinking about the decision maker entirely. You can forget about them and think about everyone else on the island for a moment. And what you're going to do is, in the sea around the island, note some of the driving forces which affect the decisions of those other actors. So it might be a force that affects 1, 2, 3, or all of the actors on the island. But the aim is to think about what uncertainties, what drivers, what trends, what forces shape their decisions. So if you think about, the island is populated with entities that our decision maker has an interaction with. The forces are beyond our decision maker's control. They're those big sweeping things in the ocean that might wash over the island and change the game. So just take a couple of minutes now, and in the seas around the island, think, what are the forces that drive the decisions of the other players in the game, the other inhabitants of that island? They can be as vast as climate change and as small as, you know, the political party in power at City Hall. They can go at almost any level of granularity. But those uncertainties and trends and factors which are beyond our decision makers' control, which lie offshore of the island and influence the decisions of the other actors. You've got 1 more minute left, and it's a chance to think, you know, how far upstream can you go as well? You know, if you've got budget as a driving force, well, what lies upstream from the budgetary decisions? What creates that environment? You can go deeper and broader with each one of these trends, just like the currents of the sea. You might start with a wave on the shore, and then you might start to think about the deeper movements of the ocean. And you've still got a few seconds left. Just the last few seconds now, and just as always, I say, take a step back for a second, look over that island, look at the sea, and maybe just get down 1 more. Is there something you'd missed? Is there another driving force in the sea around those islands that affects 1 or more of those actors? If you can spot 1 more, get it down. And then when you've done that, we need to think about which forces are actually the most uncertain or uncomfortable, which aren't you paying enough attention to, which can't be known in advance. In that ocean around the island, where are the places of mystery, of uncertainty or concern? Where are the factors where you think, well, that's uncomfortable to think about, or I prefer not to look at that. I don't really want to know the consequences of that thing. Where are the murky aspects of those currents in the sea? Which ones of those could wash ashore and really change the experience of people living on that island? I'm going to ask you to take a moment now and just identify 2 or 3 of those driving forces that you think have this quality of uncertainty and significance. Which of those forces in the sea around the island do you think, yeah, I don't know how that's going to play out, and that's really going to change the game. Like if that comes ashore on the island, it's really going to shift things for us. So just take a minute or so now to think through what that might involve. And sometimes it might be incredibly obvious that you see forces and you think, well, clearly it's these 3. And perhaps the first ones you see are the right ones, but you might also spot something that you didn't really consider a very consequential force. And perhaps it's not the obvious ones that are the ones you need to watch out for. Perhaps there's something a little bit mysterious that you need to attend to. There's something where you think we really don't know how that force is going to play out. But in the next few seconds, just mark 2 or 3 forces that you think have the potential to really reshape life on that island. And then when you've done that, it's time to tell one of these cautionary tales. We're going to add depth to that story of the future and just think through, what does the island look like if these 3 factors, 2 or 3 factors play out? If they come ashore and change the island, what's it going to look like? How is your protagonist's ecosystem reshaped? And don't worry, this is really your last bit of drawing now, and then there'll be some time for you to rest your writing hands and for me to talk. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to turn the page or take a fresh piece of paper and just draw the island again as it would look reshaped by those 2 or 3 driving forces coming into play. What would have changed on that island? Are there new actors, new winners and losers? Have the relationships changed? Has the value created by those relationships changed? I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to draw that new island. You've got about 1 more minute left. So remember, a map maker can draw a map in whatever way suits them. They turn the landscape into a representation that contains useful information. So when you draw the map of this changed island, what are you putting on that map to make clear what has changed? What is different on that island? And just 30 seconds left. You're not going to have to share these with anyone, at least not on the screen in this session. So, this can very much be in the form of a personal note to self. As long as you can see something has changed and you've captured it on this island, it's a great job. And you've got about 10 seconds left. So maybe just make the final few adjustments. And that's time. Wherever you've got to, that's the second map that you've drawn. And as I keep saying, I don't pretend that we do a wondrous job in such a short time frame, but it gives us a feel of what it's like to do this work, including potential frustrations and challenges. But we're getting a different map of what our context might look like if these driving forces come into play. And the very last element which doesn't require you to pick up your pen again, but just to think about the maps you've made, is to put your decision maker back into that new context and think about what the implications might be. So I'm going to give you a last bit of time for reflection. When you look at that first map and the second map, what has changed for your decision maker and what are the implications? Is it that the relationships have shifted? Have new entities come into being? Are there new winners and losers? Have old options closed down, but maybe new options opened up? Is this a dark future or is this a surprisingly opportune one? What moves are open to your decision maker that weren't open before? What are the changes and the challenges? Just a last few seconds for reflection. And that's time. So of course, what we might do in a different world is draw different islands to explore the different ways that forces play out. The 2 or 3 forces you've picked can probably play out in more than one direction. There may be other forces that you want to consider at play, and each one might generate a different environment for your decision maker to consider in the future. But what I'm going to do now is actually stop sharing for a second so that I can look into the chat. And I'm going to ask you just to maybe put any comments in the chat, just type in that chat on the side. What came up for you in that process? Was there anything you discovered or learned? Were there elements that were more challenging or easier for you? What came from that experience? Was there anything you unlearned? Was there anything you discovered? Just in the chat box on the right-hand side, let us know what is coming up for you when you go through that task. Siobhan says the thoughtfulness of the process. New perspectives, says Lucia or Lucia. Forgive me if I mispronounce any names I'm reading out of the chat bar. Did you notice anything about the ecosystem you currently inhabit? Did you notice anything about the trends and forces which lie offshore? What did the new island show you that the present island couldn't? Any other thoughts or comments? Angie says it's easy to forget some relationships if they're not front and center. A really good point. We're going to come on to that in the second part of this presentation. Any other final thoughts in the chat? Discoveries, challenges, some things easier to map than others. A great method to analyze options for lobbying, says Claudia. It's difficult to predict the external threats, says Corrado, very much so. Well, I'm going to move on momentarily, but I wanted to show that even with just 1 or 2 minutes per stage, it gives you a sense of how you might stretch your sense of what is going on between us and beyond amidst those sea of uncertainties offshore. And in the next part of this presentation, I just want to talk briefly about an example from the COVID era. So let me go back to resharing my screen. And once again, if someone would kindly just nod for me that the share is working correctly. Brilliant. So I'm going to talk a bit about work that is still ongoing with Reading Public Library in Pennsylvania. This is a library service serving 88,000 people in its city and another 400,000 people in its county. So perhaps a little smaller than some of the Metropolitan Library services we're talking about here, but still a reasonably significant player, an IMLS medal winner, but also inhabiting a context with significant challenges. The city in 2010 was notorious for having a significant level of poverty. It was considered the poorest small city in the nation about 10 years ago, but has been on a journey of recovery since then and is now in a different position. Considering the age of COVID and the need for a new long-term strategic plan, they started working on scenarios by bringing together a working group from across the staff, including everyone from youth specialists to board members, the fundraising officer, as well as executive level decision makers, to go through a process a little like the thing you've just experienced in the first part of this session. So that astonishing map I showed you earlier is actually a value creation map featuring a great number of significant actors. The little yellow dots on that map are the other people on the island, the other players in the game. The pink and green post-its represent value exchange in each direction, the value being given and received by the library. And the post-its in the charming sort of peach color represent the uncertainties. They are the currents in the sea that might wash ashore, the driving forces that affect those decision makers. And then just to sort of tidy up a little bit, you can see there are these blue post-its in the middle, grouping them as patron groups, the business community, higher education, K-12 education, service partners, the media, governance organizations, and so on. Now, this work was done at pace in a frugal manner because of the pressures of COVID and the demands of this particular library service. And what we often say at the business school is, you know, it's like waiting to find out the result of a sports game. If you can wait till the end of the day, avoid talking to people, sit in your favorite chair, watch the game on a high definition TV, see what people are saying on Twitter, read the sports journalists, you get a great deal of information, but it requires a greater investment of time. It requires some patience on your part. If you just roughly want to know what happened in the sports game and see the result, you might just pick up your smartphone and watch the highlights on a small screen, or you might just skim Twitter to see what the goal score was at the end of the game. So in some ways, there's a trade-off between quality and detail and the speed of iteration. But the aim was, in a relatively short period of time, under the pressures of the pandemic, to create a map like this of the relationships and the uncertainties. The question then posed by this group is that which factors could really redraw the map of Bucks County and change relationships in the community in a way that was significant for the decisions the library service had to make going forward. And they put these onto two axes, on an X and Y axis, one of which was the degree of fragmentation or cooperation in society, and the other one was whether civic life took place predominantly in digital or physical spaces. But we weren't just thinking about operational short-term questions. We actually wanted to go out further to get a vantage point that was really different to the present. So the team themselves chose to go out 20 years to the year 2040 to consider how these factors might play out over time. And by seeing these divergences, not on the basis of probability, prediction, or preference, but to see the ones that really challenged us, the aim was to actually enrich decision-making by showing people something that could not be seen in the present, that could not be extracted from existing data and evidence. And I'm sure you'll see, looking at these two factors, clearly the questions of digitalization of our society and of course political tensions in Pennsylvania that was such a battleground for the last presidential election, you can see why these two factors might be really significant for the library's long-term strategic choices. Now, the team ended up creating three scenarios which are positioned on the grid like this: Life on the Clouds, The Wild Frontier, and Paris in the Schuylkill. And eventually these will become available as public documents if you're curious. And you can see where they're positioned on the X and Y axis, which gives you a sense of what they have to say. But these three visions of 2040, I'm just going to talk you through them a little bit so you get a sense of what they mean. Life in the Clouds shows a great deal of cooperation in the Berks County of 2040, but civic life has remained largely online in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. People never really go back to congregating in physical space the way they once did. Over 20 years, that means that telepresence technologies become the norm. But a strong sense of cooperation has been built up as people saw that actually working together was the only way to get through crises like the ones we experienced in the past year and crises that might await us in the future. This was a world where actually people were very heavily surveilled, but they accepted this because of the material benefits that they gained from predictive algorithms and from technology being able to scrutinize what they were doing in their lives and make appropriate offers. However, there were new tensions, like a new generational divide. They were talking in this scenario about a generation that missed hugs compared to a younger generation that were much happier using digital technology, wearing haptic technologies that provided a physical response, people who really didn't expect or require physical presence. And in this world, the library was almost more like a public informatics commission, in the words of one of the planners. It was about regulating digital equity and ensuring that there were no digital have-nots in Berks County. It had moved quite a long distance from being an institution of culture and learning to being more about information infrastructure in the virtualized age. Over on the left-hand side of that grid, the wild frontier saw an almost complete fragmentation of civic life. Although parts of the county did return to the physical world in the wake of COVID-19, the filter bubbles turned into stockades, turned into a bunker mentality, turned into political enclaves and also corporate walled gardens, kind of like mining camps, where your employer also provided your accommodation, your utilities, and indeed the access to information and culture, which libraries had historically provided. This vision of Pennsylvania was a Second Amendment playground, where firearms were largely unregulated and new weapons, things like drones, were prevalent. For the library, this implied the end of neutrality once and for all. Questions over whether each bubble had its own library or whether there was even still the possibility of a county-wide library service. Different members of the scenario planning team explored possibilities like the library needing in some way to go rogue, the library needing to affiliate itself to a new higher power, and it pointed back to the 200-year history of Reading Public Library as having been founded by subscription and volunteers, of having only been absorbed into the city government at the start of the 20th century, and the possibility that a future might exist that was more like those elements of the past than the civic relationship we currently take for granted. In the final scenario, Paris on the Schuylkill, which is the wonderful name for the river that goes through Reading, PA, was about a return to physical space, but in a society that really began to abide by the notion that we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. The idea that we cannot survive except by clinging together through pandemics or climate change or whatever might await. This was a world of universal basic income. This was a world where the local university had become a much more significant player, and Reading, Pennsylvania had evolved into something like Austin, Texas, or Madison, Wisconsin, a lively cultural college town. It had become a destination for tourists even. And in this world, the library was more like a cultural house, very closely affiliated with the university, finding new offers for visitors, tourists, for students, and for the large number of artists who now lived in this bohemian center because of universal basic income, allowing them to pursue other pursuits or forms of employment than just kind of earning things to pay the bills. So we had three scenarios that I can only briefly outline here, but each one of them stretched our sense of what the future might hold in a challenging way. And the great futurist Jim Dator, who also has a great name for a futurist, said, you know, any idea about the future should at first appear ridiculous if it's useful, because the point is to stretch our sense of what's coming. So these three plausible scenarios helped the library service to return to this map and to ask some strategic planning questions that are slightly different from the norm, to consider where on the map should we focus our efforts, either because there are needs or because there are opportunities. We can't press down on every part of this spider web at once, so therefore, where should we choose to press? You have to forgive me, I just have to try and move the faces on this board so I can see my own screen. There we go. Pardon me. It's the joys of screen share in the age of Zoom. Clearly, we're not in the life in the cloud scenario just yet. There we are. So where on the map should we focus our efforts? Which parts might change on that map in time to come? And even, is the sea really beyond our control? If we work with those other partners on the island, are there things that we can shift and change? The example I would give is of farming. A farmer can't control whether it rains or shines tomorrow. They can't really control whether they have a good summer or a good fall. But if farmers work together with the wider community over the long run, they might be able to mitigate the impacts of climate change so they can still farm on that land for generations to come. We might not be able to affect the weather of the ecosystem our library inhabits, but if we work in partnership, we might be able to change the climate. And specifically, what this meant was that Reading Public Library is starting to attend to the parameters by which they define community co-design and creative control. If we're not doing things to the community, but with the community, how do we set the limits of that? And how do we manage those relationships? How do we configure our partnerships for maximum effect, moving from being responsive, but to being really intentional about how we work with other institutions for the good of the community we serve? And I hope you can see there are some interesting overlaps with the previous session from John and Joe. We also raised this question of what does it mean for the staff to reflect the community in times to come? There might be demographic changes associated with each of those scenarios, with other futures and with the political instabilities in Pennsylvania. Does it matter that the demographic of the library staff is quite different from the demographic of the community they serve? Is it more about inclusion, access, and having materials in the right language? Or is it necessary to change recruitment so that we see a demographic rebalancing? Is it about supporting members of the community to obtain qualifications like the MLIS so that gradually over time, we actually develop a library service which truly reflects the community they serve, and we address barriers to that kind of transformation of the workforce over this longer term? And finally, it brought the library service to consider how we create digital opportunities that suit a changing world. Each one of those three scenarios showed a very different relationship between the library service, the community, and digital technologies. So with these four pillars, it actually set people thinking strategically about what it meant for the library to go digital in a way that was resilient, robust, and flexible in the face of changing times, in the face of the real unknowability of not only how we exit the pandemic, but what that means over the years and even the decades to come. So it's really about zooming out and seeing much further than had been seen before in a traditional planning process. And all of this conducted very much by the staff with a form of coaching and consultation, which was more about giving them the tools than about doing the work for them, or someone swooping in and presenting you with visions of the future. So much of the benefit of this work is actually in the process rather than the product. The way you feel stretched and challenged when you draw those islands is as enlightening as the stories you choose to present when you talk about what is the future that we might await. That was quite a lot from me on the Reading Library scenario planning process. And you might do better to hear from a librarian themselves and get a librarian's eye view of scenario planning. So Bronwyn Gamble, the executive director at Reading, is very happy to speak with people about why they chose this process, what it required for them to go through it, and what the outcomes have been. And of course, as I said, I'll provide a PDF if you don't feel the need to jot down an email just now, but she's happy to have those conversations with you. So that's the journey that I've taken you on over the last 50 minutes, and really emphasizing the fact that, you know, tomorrow is a tool to enrich the decisions we make today. And rather than relying on prediction, rather than seeking to try and control the seas like the myth of King Canute, who wished that the tides would pull back but didn't have the power to make it happen, are there ways we can be alert and alive both to the relationships we hold within our communities and the uncertainties that might transform them, even in ways we find undesirable or in ways that seemed too bright to hope for, like the utopian vision of Paris on the Schuylkill. Every future has its challenges, but every future also stretches us to think differently about the situation we're in. And I'm hopeful that these will prove useful tools in the decision-making that you face in times to come, particularly with regard to who staffs our libraries, how they serve that community, and the relationship between those who are within the library service and those who are outside being served or partnered by it. I'm going to stop sharing at this point so we can have a little discussion in the final minutes. But once I've spoken with people in this way, I'm very happy for you to pick my brains. I'm sometimes slow to respond to emails, but I always get back to it. And there's a link there, mechanicaldolphin.com. So you can say hello and ask me any questions or send me any comments after this session. Thank you so much for your time. And yes, any questions, any comments, whether verbally or in the chat.
So I'm going to go to my gallery view. So I found this session fascinating. When I was at the Free Library of Philadelphia, we did a scenario planning process, but you know, timing, when you go through a scenario planning process, timing is absolutely everything. And I'm fascinated to learn about Reading, because the Reading I knew not that long ago is a different Reading than it is now. It's wonderful to see that come about. But one of the things that I want to confirm with you, Matt, is once you developed the scenarios, I think it's important that people know that it's not one thing or another. It's creating the flexibility to know that if you're in a dystopian space, what are you going to do? What's the pivots that you need to make in order to get to the Paris on the Schuylkill opportunities?
Yes, that's nicely said, Siobhan. I think these are as much about stretching our sense of what's going on around us. So very much not that these are the only alternatives in play. And in fact, one of the great benefits of scenarios is when people disagree with them. You know, a disagreement is like someone who bothers to complain to your service. You know, you're 90% of the way there because they care enough to complain. So one of the things that these scenarios were used for was for the library to take them out to other stakeholders, other parts of the city, to show we're being proactive about thinking about the future. And also just that balance of like, we really can't choose whether we get to Paris on the Schuylkill, except if we do it together. And it might be that we only get to pull towards the right-hand side of that axis away from the fragmented left, but it's more about providing some guidance. So it's more about mapping than giving options, as you rightly said. And of course, one of the great challenges are there are scenario planners and then there are scenario planners. And being able to pick your consultant is also a trick.
Yeah, a lot of research to be done there, right?
Definitely.
You know, but one of the things that I find important about this process, and this is for everybody that's listening, it is an incredible process to go through, and it's a bit mind-bending. It does take a lot of energy to sort of take yourself from one place to another, and it's also what it does is create the reality of what you don't want to be, and all of the things that you need to put into place to make sure you don't go there as much as you can, because it is those sort of uncontrollables, like who's the next administration that's going to come in and just drive everything you thought you were going to do crazy, right? So
definitely.
Yeah.
I think one of the things is also remembering you can't always control your context, and it's who you become in that situation. So I've seen libraries get really enormous financial windfalls that they struggled to manage because it's like, what do we do with all this money? And now we have a different role and people expect different things from us. And I've seen libraries suffer immensely financially, but what that gave them was a great deal of clarity strategically. Like if we only have a few coins, we have to make them count. So we're going to do this. It's not a desirable future, but it's a good situation. And that mind-bending element, I just wanted to acknowledge, it's really useful if it stretches you. I know I was doing a scenario set for a large American telecommunications corporation a couple of years ago, and we had a scenario where people really distrusted 5G technology to the extent they were like smashing 5G infrastructure. And they said, don't bother developing that one because it's not plausible to us. And of course, in certain parts of the world, people are in fact experiencing high levels of 5G paranoia now. So yeah, that element of discomfort is actually key to the process, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, folks, questions. Hopefully you have some. A lot of names on screens instead of faces, right? Nobody has a question?
I think I should leave you with a question, because also we've had a long, intense session. There was time for writing. There's loads of stuff you need to chew on before you really digest what was in that presentation.
Mhm.
But you know, like when we look back now at the pandemic, we can see things that, you know, like if we had a time machine, there are probably messages we would send back to our past self in 2019 saying, you need to do this, that, you need to do the other things. What's the equivalent for 2030? You know, like when you imagine that far ahead, maybe some of us, we've retired, we've moved on, but if we imagine the legacy we are going to leave, the decisions we make now will have a consequence, will have an impact on that library of 2030. What different versions of 2030 might be out there? How are they going to judge the decisions we're taking now? Because I think that's the real gift of this approach in the way it complements other approaches to strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, the big sort of what do I want to say, the big boulder that sort of came upon us in the past, you know, 14 months ago, 15 months ago, was this pandemic. And all of a sudden we were all like, excuse the expression, holy shit, what are we going to do? And how, you know, how our entire worlds had to shift, pivot, change, and understand just what it is we were all going to become and be, and how we were going to be supportive of those of us around us. But what the pandemic sure did do was expose all the stuff that was on the surface and just below when it comes to who gets served, when they get served, how they get served. All of the issues around socio-emotional access learning. It's been remarkable, all of that exposure, when all of a sudden you're hit with something you don't even know how to deal with, you don't know what it is, and what are you going to do to respond? Yeah.
And that's really that benefit of the imaginative, isn't it? Can you hit yourself with the shock before the real shock arrives?
Right.
I had a
Right.
conversation with the director of the National Science Museum in Australia, who is also a science advisor to the federal government. And when we first met, he said, you know, we don't need this. Like, we're okay. We have a really good strategic plan. We have really robust strategy procedures in place. And then we were chatting some distance into 2020. And he said, this year, we had catastrophic bushfires come right up to the Australian capital and affect us because it's where we're at. We had hailstones that were so bad, they smashed the windscreens, the windshields of every car in our parking lot, and they smashed our roof panels. And then we had a global pandemic. And he went, it turns out even I have some strategic blind spots when it comes to the future.
Yeah.
Like
Never mind all the social justice issues that have been exposed worldwide. Yeah.
Well, precisely.
Mhm.
But thank you all so much for your time together. And I'm really happy to follow up if people have discussions further on the line. I know you have so many presentations to get through today, and I want to help you get back on time if that's of help.
You have, Matt. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I think everybody's nodding their heads. This was really very, very, very fun in a lot of ways. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for having me.
All right,
Cheers.
Matt. A pleasure.
Bye-bye.
All right, Mr. Barber.
Okay, now we welcome Liz Weaver. Liz Weaver is the co-CEO at the Tamarack Institute, which joked a bit about being just down the road from Toronto. Actually, Liz is from Waterloo, which is just down the road from Toronto. She has at the Tamarack Learning Center, it advances community change and is very well known for her thought leadership on collective impact. Very passionate about the power and potential of communities getting to impact on complex issues. And today is covering the topic adaptive leadership, a core skill that I think we all recognize will be very useful in this particular time, and as we look at our staffs in 2030. Liz will focus on essential components of adaptive leadership and help us kind of look at what's happening and navigate work and change from a systems perspective. So a great way to cap off our day and our other presentations. I think you have been made co-host, Liz, so take it away.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and really a pleasure to join everybody today. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Hang on. It really is such a pleasure, and I was excited to sit in on Matthew's presentation. You'll notice that there is overlap in thinking and concepts. Certainly the way that we approach adaptive leadership and what Matthew presented in terms of scenario planning and thinking about futures is really related to adaptive leadership, and certainly, you know, what we've all collectively gone through in the last 14 to 18 months has been, I think, a real stretch for us, as you said, both Jeff and Siobhan. Okay. So I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we are all meeting on Indigenous land. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. And I'm actually joining you while Tamarac's offices are located in Waterloo region. I am actually joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas in what is known as Hamilton, Ontario. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is really a covenant that looks at the relationship that Indigenous peoples had with the Great Lakes. And the dish is the Great Lakes, and the spoon is the notion that we all benefit and we all eat from the Great Lakes. And so, you know, it's really an acknowledgement of the stewardship and the ownership that we have over this land, and the fact that we have to pay attention to it. And we learn that from the Indigenous elders, and we benefit from that wisdom. I'd also like to acknowledge the Regina Public Library as host of these last 2 days and these sessions, and to recognize that the Regina Public Library is on Treaty 4 territory, as Matthew acknowledged as well, and that it is the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. And so I think, you know, in Canada, we've gone through a process of truth and reconciliation, and we're still deeply embedded in that process in the 92 calls to action, and recognizing and acknowledging our Indigenous elders and the land that we are joining you from is an important part of the work that we do in our truth and reconciliation journey. So Tamarack, for those of you that don't know about us, we are a not-for-profit organization. We have two parts to our work, and one part is really working with communities across Canada, the US, and globally in 4 areas of change. This slide only tells you 3 because we just recently launched our 4th area. So we're really interested in how communities can play a pivotal role in reducing poverty. And we have a network of about 300 communities that are engaged in that work. How communities can decrease social isolation and loneliness. And so that's called deepening community work. And then we're also, we recently launched with our partners in the federal government of Canada, Communities Building Youth Futures. And that's an opportunity for communities to take a holistic approach to supporting young people in their journey through education to post-secondary education, employment, or training. And then most recently, we launched an initiative called Climate Transitions, which is really an opportunity to engage communities and community leaders in conversations about the climate and how climate is impacting all of our lives in real and tangible ways. So that's our community-based work. And then our other work is really focused on learning and how to create a platform of learning for community change makers, and we focus on 5 interconnected practices, and you can see those on the screen. So that's a little bit about Tamarack. We invite you to come to our website. It's a dense website with lots of resources, but you know, we know that libraries are very involved in community change and often are partners around the 400 community tables that we support through our work. So I'm going to explore with you a couple of ideas in the time that I have this morning. I'm going to actually lean a little bit into what Matthew was talking about and really focus on how do we navigate in a post-pandemic world and what that means for adaptive leadership. Give you a tool to help you think through adaptive challenges versus technical challenges. Give you an approach about thinking about how to create the space for adaptive work, and then another tool, and with another tool that might be helpful to you in terms of adaptive teams and how to really mobilize them by understanding how they're coming to the table. And you can use this tool internally at the library, or as Matthew took you through that process, with your external stakeholders as well. It's just another way of looking at, he had you draw an island and look at the forces in the island. This is another way of kind of trying to make sense of all of those forces and all of the different stakeholders that are engaged in moving libraries forward and moving communities forward towards success. So navigating a post-pandemic world. So a little bit of context. Tamarack has just gone through a strategic planning process, which has been really interesting for us to be able to do it during a pandemic, which is also kind of unique. But it's also about thinking, what are the things, the areas of influence for Tamarack? And one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to is how to navigate complexity. And so if you can think about, you know, the work of libraries in communities, but also of communities in many ways, they are really complex adaptive systems, right? There are things that are happening within the community context that are changing all the time. And when we think about complexity, we really lean into the work of Dave Snowden and others around how do we understand different kinds of problems and how do we enter into this kind of problem space or this opportunity space. Some of us choose to look at problems as opportunities. And, you know, he talks a lot about, you know, the fact that there are obvious, complicated or technical problems, complex problems, or chaotic problems. And chaotic problems tend to happen more in the environmental context, although we've all lived through the early days of the pandemic was really a chaotic problem. It had both chaos and complexity woven in. And you can see in this slide that there are real ways that we could respond to different types of problems. And it's really understanding the differences or the nuances in the problems and then figuring out what's the right approach. And so that's been really important for us at Tamarack, and a way of kind of thinking about the work that we are engaged in community change. And it's also really important from an adaptive leadership perspective, because is it a obvious or simple problem? What are the strategies we might employ there? Is it a complicated or technical problem? Do we need to bring experts to the forefront, or does it live in the zone of complexity or chaos? And each of those requires a different kind of adaptive leadership skill set. The other thing that I think is important, and this is some of the work that we did at Tamarack when we started to think about our strategic planning, and it actually does lead into or lead back into the work that Matthew just talked about. So we looked at 3 different scenarios that might face us as an organization, but I would argue that it will face many of us as organizations, kind of navigating both the pandemic and the post-pandemic world. And so, you know, even though it may or may not have been true, there was this kind of stability that we had, right? We had these routines and this way of working, and then the pandemic hit. It became this kind of big disruption in our work. And the futures that we have ahead of us are 3 that we've identified as part of our strategic planning process. One is this kind of push that we all have to return to the old equilibrium, right? We know that we've gone through this disruption, but boy, if we could just hug again, or if we could just bring the folks back into, our library settings, what would that look like? And so there are lots of people, and you can read a lot on social media and other places, that there's this big push to return to the old equilibrium. Another future scenario is that there might be a new equilibrium that comes out of this. And those of us that are engaged in social justice work or poverty reduction work, there are conversations now about, the unequal impacts of COVID on different demographics in different parts of our populations. And so what we're looking for is this new kind of equilibrium that has more of a social justice and equity ethic, and is dealing with some of the anti-racism conversations that, certainly have emerged during the pandemic and emerged as a result of, the truth and reconciliation process in Canada, and also the things that have happened in the United States relative to George Floyd and others. And so can we find this new equilibrium that has these dimensions embedded in it? And then the final scenario that we looked at was this notion of, yes, we've gone through this big disruption, but the reality is that there might continue to be disruptions, and they may not necessarily be as big, but governments of all sorts are investing pretty heavily in the rollout of vaccines and also stabilizing their economies. That money that is being spent now might have a splash and ripple effect that in future, we might experience future disruptions where there will be less resources available to us from government funding, from philanthropy. And we're already seeing this at Tamarack with some of our core funders who have invested really heavily in stabilizing food systems, food access systems. And they're saying to us, there are early signals now that say, we don't have the same amount of money to distribute going forward post-pandemic. And so, as we were going through our scenario planning at Tamarack, we were building scenarios that responded to all three of these, or building responses that kind of reflected all three of these scenarios. And I think it is really helpful to kind of consider, what are the potential futures that we're facing, and what does that mean for the kind of leadership that we need to, invest in our staff teams and invest in ourselves, and how are we more adaptive, and how are we more agile, and what are the things we need to be considering as we go forward. Another contextual piece is a paper that I wrote with my colleagues at the Civic Canopy in Denver, Colorado. And one of the things that we were really interested in this paper was, how are leaders responding during the pandemic? And this was written in about April, May of last year. And we were really interested in kind of the leadership response. And we're now interested in the sustainability or the durability of that kind of leadership. And we identified kind of three leadership responses that we noticed that were happening in communities. And the first was this notion of responsive leadership. And responsive leadership are examples. So in my community of Hamilton, Ontario, there's this group that kind of emerged from nowhere and they set up Caremongering Hamilton. And the notion of Caremongering Hamilton was that they were going to respond to citizens that were in crisis in the community. They were going to leverage resources. And we saw this happen in a lot of communities across Canada and the US and in other places, where groups of citizens came together, said, hey, there's a big need in our community, we need to respond. How the question that we have about responsive leadership is, how do we weave the responsive approach into our work going forward, but also how sustainable is it? How resilient is responsive leadership? The second area of leadership that we saw really deepen during the pandemic, and particularly from a community perspective, was collaborative leadership. And these are kind of nodes of leadership, collaboratives that exist in many communities. And really, they were turned to by core agencies, core government departments to say, we need a distribution network. So how can we distribute these resources into the community? And, having these collaborative leadership pools of resources in communities really helped, stabilize communities and stabilize the life for many individuals in our communities. And, libraries in many ways played a pretty pivotal role in this as anchor institutions. And then the final type of leadership that we noticed emerged during the pandemic is what we call disruptive emergent leadership. And this was leadership that really, when we had the George Floyd murder in the United States, people came out and entered into the streets, not only in the United States, but across Canada, and even in a global experience responding to that. And so what they were trying to do, and what they continue to try to do, is disrupt the status quo and really create these emergent nodes. And so again, how this ties into adaptive leadership is these forms have emerged during the pandemic or have strengthened during the pandemic. How do we as communities really continue to build from these forms of leadership, and how do we then adapt our own leadership skill sets in libraries to really consider that? So those are kind of contextual backgrounds, the fact that there are different kinds of problems and we need different kinds of ways of understanding problems and adaptive solutions, that there are different scenarios that will emerge for all of us post-pandemic, and then that there are these different nodes of leadership that have emerged in our communities. And so when we think about adaptive leadership, Ron Heifetz is really well known for his writing in this area, and he really talks about it as the act of a group of individuals mobilizing folks to handle tough challenges and emerge triumphant at the end. So it's really about that kind of thinking about that tough challenge, the challenge that we faced during the pandemic, and then kind of understanding how can we build our scenarios, how can we build our approaches that really helps us to be to emerge triumphant through this process. And so adaptive leadership really kind of looks at things that are critical elements in all of our work. So what is the environment, either the business environment or the community environment that we're dealing with? How do we lead with empathy in this work? What is the self-correction and reflection that we have to go through as part of this process? And some of that is the work that you're doing, the last 2 days, is to really think about, okay, so a lot of this is learning new skills, thinking about your library system in different kinds of ways, and really thinking about, okay, so how do I correct in this kind of context? And then finally, thinking about what is the win-win scenario that we really need to create, and how do we co-create it? So at Tamarack, one of the things that we really think about a lot is, the fact that there are, in every community, there's this wealth of resources, knowledge, skills, and opportunities. And the way that communities can grow and thrive is when we enter into a space of co-creation. And that really does lean into those kind of adaptive leadership skill sets. It's really about, thinking about who else needs to be in this conversation with me, and what are the forms of leadership that have emerged. So there are characteristics that really kind of are connected to adaptive leadership. And so the first characteristic is really about emotional intelligence. So as a leader within a library system, what's my level of emotional intelligence, and how do I grow that, or how do I grow that within my team? What's the organizational justice that we have to pay attention to, and how do we create opportunities for increased voices? And I loved, the image that Matthew shared about the Reading library system, where you had all of the stakeholders join together and build the shared map. And that is a rich and deep kind of experience to take people through. That is about organizational justice. It's about creating the opportunity for many voices to come forward. how do we learn new things, and how do we enter into this space being as transparent and as creative as possible, really bringing in these tools and resources that are out there that can really help enhance the experience. And there's so many of them, as we know at Tamarack. So adaptive leadership, from the perspective of the Harvard Business Review, is about anticipation. It's about articulation, or creating the spaces where things can be articulated in a co-creative kind of way. It's about adaptation, really about continuous learning and adjustment of responses. And so even though Tamarack responded to those 3 scenarios that we identified, even 6 months out, we could probably go back to our responses and adapt them even further. And at 1 year out, we could do the same. And so as we continue down our journey of our strategic plan, it's really living the plan to its fullest capacity, and then accountability. So these are really critical kind of skill sets to have within an adaptive leadership framework. And so it's really thinking about, core questions, right? So as we think about adaptive leadership from a post-pandemic perspective, what are the things that we learned during the pandemic? How did we adapt well during the pandemic? What are the unique nuances that happened in our library system, with our library teams, with our philanthropic partners, with our community partners? What should we conserve? What should we keep? What should we nurture, and what can we further develop? And what are the things that didn't work so well? So what do we discard? What are the things that we could stop doing? How might we tweak things? I, entered into a conversation a couple of months ago with a number of organizations, and one of the conversations was, the person said, in my organization, what I noticed in our response to the pandemic was we were able to make decisions a lot quicker. We had to. We couldn't, have endless meetings. We actually came together in Zoom meetings, very short, and we made a decision and we acted. How do we keep that? How do we keep that momentum going, as opposed to going back to that future where we spent endless hours of meetings? And then the final question to ask is, how do we innovate? And these are all really good questions when you're thinking about adapting forward or moving your organization or your library system forward towards success. So a critical component of adaptive leadership is the ability to really diagnose adaptive challenges. And so Heifetz and Linsky will talk about, adaptive leadership as the ability to look both from the dance floor, so be on the dance floor in the organization or the community or the library system, but also look at the system from the balcony. It's that kind of two-eyed seeing that is really critical in this work. And so part of it requires these kind of 4 core steps, right? Which is diagnosing the system both by being in the midst of the system, but also looking at it from a balcony or from a more external perspective. Understanding yourself as part of the system. And so what are you doing that's contributing to the system's success? And what are you doing that's holding the system back? And what are the things that you need to consider? Then think about mobilizing the system and then taking action. So it's kind of interesting to consider the work from the balcony and the dance floor. He also talks about in his work, technical problems versus adaptive challenges. And technical problems, that's where there's an intersection between Snowden and Heifetz's work, is that a technical problem might also be known as a complicated problem. Is easy to identify. You can solve it by authority or expertise. People are generally responsive to technical solutions, whereas adaptive or complex problems are much more difficult to identify, and they're also very easy to deny. So at Tamarack, we do a lot of work in place-based poverty reduction, and we know that libraries, because they are anchor institutions in communities, have had to also play a role in all of that. And so in some communities, when we've entered in, people will say, yes, there's poverty in our community, but we're doing lots about it, right? Even though they may or may not be, or even though it's not on their radar screen. And so, you know, in the community that I live in Hamilton, when we started place-based poverty reduction work, a number of years ago before I joined Tamarack, when I would talk about poverty with my colleagues in the community, they would talk about, particularly elected officials, they would talk about economic development. And yes, they are related. And yes, they are two sides of a coin, but if you don't deal with issues of poverty in your community, you will never fully get to the issues of economic development. And so it's really kind of, how do we create the space for these more challenging conversations, and to really enter into the space of trying to move forward in these adaptive challenges. So here's an example, and I have to admit, I'm not from the library system, so you might say, oh, this is a pretty simplified example, but here, you know, book acquisition, you know, what are the demographics and what are the interests that you see, who has the authority within the system to identify which books will be part of the acquisition, and you know, what is the work. And then adaptive, kind of a scenario related to an adaptive challenge is to deal with diverse users within your library system. And I, you know, when I was writing this, I was thinking about the downtown branch of the Hamilton Public Library, where they have, if you enter into the space, they have a bank of computers that are utilized by all sorts of individuals across the community, some of whom are homeless. And it is a space, you know, a welcoming space for different individuals. And so what are the things that the library had to do to create the right kind of space that supported a diversity of clients in the community? And so you can see how these problems shift in different kinds of ways, and what is required when you're kind of considering a more adaptive challenge. Some things that we naturally do in dealing with adaptive challenges is that we enter into this place of work avoidance, right? And so there's kind of these 3 Ds, right? We sometimes say, well, it's not our problem, it's the other organizations in the community's problem. So we displace the responsibility because we don't want to deal with the complexity of the problem. Sometimes there's denial. Well, if we enter into this space, it won't really change anything anyways. And you can see this when communities are trying to really lean into a complex issue, and there's real pushback from some of the core systems within the community. And so that really represents itself as denial. And sometimes there is this kind of scenario around diverting attention. And this is can happen within an organizational system, like a library system, where you restructure or you reorganize, or you know, you don't have necessarily the competency set. And so we see this emerge, you know, when communities and when systems are really trying to deal with complex adaptive challenges. And these are natural responses. And what's interesting is to kind of think about, okay, what am I seeing emerge as we're trying to adjust our library system in a different kind of way? And then how do we figure out the way to respond to this? Because if you don't respond, if you're not able to identify some of this kind of work avoidance approaches, then often you will not be successful in the long run in terms of being a truly transformative and adaptive organization. So this is an opportunity, or a way that we would often take our groups through. Think about a challenge that you're currently facing, and really think about the technical elements of that challenge and the adaptive elements of that challenge. And, you know, it's interesting because challenges and opportunities might have both, right? They might have some technical components to it, and they might have some adaptive. So if you take take poverty as challenge that your community is facing. There are certainly adaptive elements to that challenge, but there are some technical elements as well. You know, how do we get food to families in our communities? There are some where you can bring some experts to the table and you can really dive into the technical components. And that's where the expertise is important. The adaptive part is where you need to have multiple voices sharing their wisdom and their knowledge about that challenge, and then thinking about, okay, so how do we co-create or co-design a solution together? So here's a great model around adaptive leadership, which kind of builds into, you know, adaptive challenges, technical challenges, how the leaders need to behave, and what the adaptive work looks like. So quite a simple way of pulling the last couple of slides together. So how do we create the space for adaptive work? So often adaptive work is when we're at the precipice of falling over the edge of the cliff, right? And I don't think we really want that to happen. We were, you know, as part of COVID, we were pushed out to the edge of the cliff, but we can really, you know, as we're thinking about our library systems post-COVID, we can actually move closer, reflect on what happened during this most recent kind of adaptive challenge that we faced, do a little bit of kind of thinking about that. And then as future disruptions and future adaptive challenges come forward, how do we build the skill sets and the competencies that we need within our system and within our staff team to deal with future disruptions? Because the reality is that there will always be these future disruptions. That I kind of lean into the third scenario. I do think that, you know, if we think about climate, if we think about the economies of our communities, the economies of the philanthropy community, that there will be these kind of future disruptions, at least in the short term. So here are some things that you want to think about in terms of creating space for adaptive work. And we use the idea of a pressure cooker, right? Because in a pressure cooker scenario, you can either turn up the heat or turn down the heat. And so it's really thinking about what are the elements that we have to pay attention to in adaptive work. And then, you know, to what degree can we, you know, think more deeply about these elements, turn up the heat, or what are some of them that we can maybe not think so much about right now because they're not necessarily completely relevant in our context. And so this list is pretty self-evident, and I'm sure you'll be able to add some additional things to the list. The other thing is to think about, you know, the elements from the perspective of authority, direction, protection, and order. And if you recall a couple of slides ago, I talked about, you know, coming at this work from building capacity within our organizations. We also need to consider, you know, what are some of the parameters of adaptive work and creating that space, and what's the authority, what's the direction that we're providing, what's the protection. And I'm sure that as you all entered into the pandemic from your library system perspective, not really knowing how the pandemic, the kind of longer term impacts of the pandemic, you probably had to consider, okay, so my role, what's the authority that I have? What direction do I give to my staff and to our key partners and our key donors? How do I create safe spaces for individuals on our staff team? And then now as we're going back into community, how do we create safe spaces? How do we protect them coming back into community? And what's the kind of, what's the sequence of events, the order of events going forward? And so even related to the pandemic, you can see how, you know, these four components are critical to kind of consider. Again, when you roll on technical and adaptive challenges and you think about direction, protection, roles, etc., I think this slide is a really helpful way of kind of thinking about, how these different elements play out across these different domains. So some of the traits for adaptive leaders, and I would imagine that all of us in the room have some of these traits, and then others that we wished we had or that we're working towards. So there are things like, how do we link to our core values, our abilities, and the dreams of our team members and our stakeholders? How do we welcome and embrace a diversity of views and really take advantage of the collective knowledge? What is the ability to have some of that foresight? And I think that Matthew's session just before just gave you some really great skills around foresight to kind of consider, going forward. What's our persistence and what's our willingness to kind of live in that pressure cooker that we have and all those elements within the pressure cooker? And how can we admit when we're making mistakes or be open to experimentation and risk taking? And to what degree do our boards provide us with that kind of ability to be a risk taker? And then how do we really, celebrate success and advance innovation and courage from our employees and our stakeholders? So I'm going to end with just a tool for all of you. This is a way of kind of understanding or diagnosing an adaptive challenge. And so you could put your adaptive challenge in the center and then think about the various stakeholders that you might be connected to. What values do they have relative to the challenge? So what are the values that they bring? Do they value diversity of voice? Do they value efficiency of spending money? What are the values? What are their loyalties? And relative to the adaptive challenge, what are the losses that they might experience? So if you think about the pandemic and navigating a post-pandemic world as the adaptive challenge, you might want to think about, okay, put yourself there. What are the values that you have relative to the library, but also your personal values? What are some of the loyalties that you have? And in this kind of response to the pandemic, what are some of the losses that you have faced? And we've all faced them individually. We face losses of connection, losses of relationship. We might have faced losses relative to our own personal health. So it's really kind of considering this, and you can map your stakeholders and yourself around this using this tool. It's quite an interesting tool to kind of go through. And so when you're using the tool, you might want to think about it relative to these different stakeholder groups. So who might be some allies, who might be some dissenters, who might be some of those undecided folks who will have a positive impact, and who are potential casualties from the adaptive challenge that you're trying to resolve. And there are some questions that you can consider as you go through the process. And so it's, again, just another tool that we often use with our communities when they are trying to end poverty or decrease social isolation, to really dive deeper into the thinking of different stakeholders that they're engaged with around the community. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully you can see the connections between the two presentations. I think what Matthew did was really set the scenario for thinking about the shifting land that we all find ourselves on right now, the shifting sand that we all find ourselves on. And what it really speaks to is this need for adaptive leadership and adaptive leadership capacity, not only within ourselves, but then if we think about our broader team, how do we build that within our broader team? How do we recruit that onto our boards of directors or other community stakeholders that we're working with? So what are your next steps? That's my question to you. And we'll open it up for some questions or for some conversation.
So I want to thank you, Liz. That was, again, another fabulous presentation. And I want to thank you for that. One of the big takeaways for myself in thinking about the how do I want to describe it, is the the real reality around leadership in this, particularly in the past, during the pandemic time. You've talked a lot about it, and one of the things that, as I was listening to you, I really thought, what this really does bring out, whether it's your presentation, Matt's presentation, and then John and Joe's presentation, it really is about deeply thinking about the culture, the library culture, and what it is you're going to do and how it is you need to think about the organization. And I wanted to get your thoughts around how this connects into library culture, the work of adaptive leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about adaptive leadership is a cultural change, right? So it is a philosophy, it is an approach, it is a way of being and thinking. And I do think, if you're thinking about the fact, if you're leaning into the idea that, libraries exist in communities which are complex adaptive systems, to what degree can our library system be adaptive and resilient in this context, right? And so if that is true for you, then you want to think about, okay, then how do we build this culture of innovation, this cultural spirit of adaptation, and how do we grow that within the context of the library so that and I think, libraries are like this. That is my experience with libraries, that you are innovative, you are creative, you are responsive to communities. So in many ways, you are already embodying those key attributes. Is adaptation, or is growing adaptive leadership, does that reflect in the core values of the organization and the way you are and the way you're thinking of and being? And then how do you reflect that even more? So yeah, Peter Drucker says that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so it really is kind of considering, and I like to look at culture as, what are the stories that we're telling each other about ourselves? Is really kind of both the stories that we articulate out loud, but also the ones that we maybe whisper in the corners. And so, how can we grow this culture of innovation and creativity and adaptation, even more than we have? Particularly, I think the context is really calling for it right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Such a good presentation, and it's just sort of what this did was really brilliantly sort of bring together almost all five of the all brought together into how it is we think about the future of our organizations in a really fascinating way. There's a question for you in chat from Liz. Have you worked with public libraries, and which libraries are using the Tamarack Institute approach to collective impact and adaptive leadership?
I have colleagues that have worked with libraries, and I can't pick them out at the moment, unfortunately, but we have worked with public libraries. We've also been partnered with the Hardwood Institute in the United States, who's also thinks very much in the ways that we think at Tamarack. And so it is interesting. At Tamarack, one of the things that we really like is looking at different ways of thinking and knowledge that is being created out there, and then thinking about how do these play out in communities, and how can we, as a entity, help communities get better at the work that they're doing. And I know that Hardwood, certainly in his work, Rich Hardwood in the United States of the Hardwood Institute, has really built a strong partnership, I think, with the U.S. library system around.
Done a lot of work with the American Library Association. Yes.
Yeah, within this kind of notion of turning outward, right?
Yes.
So often organizations and collaborative tables face inward. They really face on, okay, we've got a tough problem to solve. We're going to try to build our own strengths and capacities. And so how do we kind of do that in a way that has a lot of intention behind it? And what Hardwood talks about, and what we also talk about at Tamarack, is this notion of turning outward to communities and really engaging the broader philosophy or the broader knowledge and wisdom of the community and the work that is happening, and really creating this notion of movements for change, right? So, it's particularly around complex issues. So if you want to, really decrease social isolation and loneliness in your community, you have to raise the issue up in your community, create a sense that, some of the things that we have in our community are creating increased social isolation and loneliness. And yet, where are the bright spots in our community to decrease those? And how do we create this web of those kinds of resources? And so, I think about library spaces as being pretty instrumental to that, and the way that you do your work, not only in a physical space, but also in the digital space, right? Creating those connections. I know that Toronto public library system and probably other public library systems have now book clubs that are virtual and online, where they gather people together and they create the space for conversation to happen even more deeply. So, I do have a library system that I worked with. As I was talking about the Toronto Public Library, that was a system. We did a series of workshops with them around adaptive leadership and growing the capacity of their team around adaptive leadership a couple of years ago. So there you go.
Great. We'll have to tap into Vickery.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Anybody else have questions here, folks? I hope so. I think one of the most important things that has happened in libraries over the past, 10, 12 years is that we really have made a significant pivot externally, really reaching out deeply into community to think about civic engagements, think about this sort of civil relationships, and have the library really take on that role of, the quintessential civic institution in wherever you are. It really has, it's been remarkable change. And one of the things, when I was at the Free Library of Philadelphia, in order to sort of, when you think about the issues around loneliness and outreach, one of the things we did, and a number of libraries around the country have done this as well, is bring in the social workers as part of the staffing infrastructure, and has been an important sort of relationship builder, particularly for people that were, and a lot of times librarians and library staff do not know how to work with somebody who's homeless, and does not know how to work with somebody who's experiencing trauma. So let's not pretend that we know how to do this. Let's bring in the experts and make them part of the sort of the collegial infrastructure that's important to this work,
Yeah, and I see that a lot, and it is, I think, important to kind of recognize that there is a wealth of resources in every community, right? That we can draw from and that we can partner with. And if you think about complex problems, they shape shift as well. Even as we begin to intervene in a complex problem, we know that the complex problem shape shifts, right? Which requires kind of the adaptive leadership skill set. And I was thinking, my experience with the library system is that, even in my community of Hamilton, it's not only a community where there is poverty and homelessness, but it's also a community with a high degree of newcomers and immigrants and refugees. And so the adaptability of the library to meet, the needs of the community in different kinds of ways really does mean that system has to shift and adapt and really understand the context of the community and the shifting context of the community, and what that can mean for how they grow as a system and how they connect with others. And I'm sure that across the entire group of participants, you are all kind of dealing with these challenges in your own communities in different kinds of ways and with different contexts. One thing that I think is a really important thing to consider, in this work of community change or being responsive and adaptive, is what is the context in which we're working. And so, so much of Tamarac's work is not about, while we do like collective impact, it's not about saying that every community should embrace collective impact or every form of collaborative work should embrace collective impact. It's really what is the context and what is the right approach and the right solution to support that context moving forward. So it's that notion of really leaning into communities, as I know libraries do, and really understanding the context in Regina or the context in Philadelphia or what that might look like, and then how are we responsive.
The interesting thing about collective impact is how you get everybody to give up a little bit in order to get to the center, right?
Yeah.
I know I just said that very quickly. So for those whose English is not the first language, what we're, really around collective impact is you have to give up something in order to create a greater good. And that's hard work and takes years to really get it right.
Well, and I think, particularly in a collective impact approach, it's really understanding the levels of trust that we have across our community already,
right.
the levels and the degrees of relationships that we have built, and again, the complexity of the problem, right?
Right.
So all of those things really come into play before you can think about, okay, is collective impact the right solution or the right approach for us? In some cases it may be, and in other cases you might need to build more collaborative muscle to get to a collective approach.
Right.
So yeah, there's lots. We could do a whole other hour on collective impact. It's something I'm also very passionate about, but yeah, I think it is an interesting frame for working collectively across systems and really leaning into the opportunity for influencing systems change.
Right, I agree. Okay, anybody else with a question for Liz? Okay, seeing none. Jeff, do you want to bring in Liz? Thank you so much. Really fabulous presentation. And I have to say, as I said a minute ago, this was a really great culmination presentation that brought everything all together really in a really great way. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Indeed, thank you, Liz. And I want to take just a second to thank all of you for coming to Regina, and I get to give you the good news that the sun came out. So the last day of our conference was not rainy. It is sunny, and you can look forward to a very easy flight home. I would have to confess that and maybe Maureen is feeling the same way today, that these 4 a.m. in my time start, I kind of feel a little jet lagged. So it's just like going to a normal MetLib. And it has been great to see so many familiar faces again, and great to see everyone get back together, even if it's only for a couple of hours, for a couple of days, while we, I guess, take this. It's a bit of a conference stop on the way to a next in-person full MetLib, maybe in 2022.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for coming to Regina.
So I also want to thank, I'll do one more time, to thank Jeff and Jeff's team and Regina Public Library for hosting our virtual 2-day conference. Jeff, you guys did a terrific job. All the presenters were wonderful. And, Ruth on her presentation on building diversity and diverse consciousness and attracting and retaining a diverse staff. Wonderful. Again, Lourdes Aceves and Vickery Bowles and Roosevelt Weeks on the importance of data fluency and how we build narrative in the story of library impact. And then, of course, John and Joe Payton early this morning or early afternoon or early evening, depending upon where you are, really on the necessity of cultural change in our public libraries, specifically from moving from traditional library services to more community based services and then eventually into needs-based services. It was a fascinating presentation. I thought Dr. Matt Finch did a fantastic presentation on scenario planning and the important, really deep work that we have to do in order to be really thoughtful about the future of our libraries and the ability to be flexible and pivot depending upon the changes as occur. And then, of course, Liz just now on adaptive leadership. And I loved her analogy of saying that you need to be not only on the dance floor, but to be able to look at the system from the balcony. I thought that was fabulous. All right. Again, Jeff, thank you. This was great. And thank you, everybody. I loved seeing everybody's names. You should all turn on and just wave to each other and say goodbye, because this was been a great 2 days. There we come, Liz Ton. Yay, everybody. All right, no, people are just gonna hide behind their cameras. There's a lot of comments in the chat. Take a peek at the chat before you leave. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Indeed.
And thank you to TC Conway for all of the great digital, work in the background as well. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.